What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with second part of What if Naruto was ignored by the world, but chosen by the most ancient power alive? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments, and also check the description box to original creator of this beautiful creation. A landmass that covers a mammoth amount of area. A land that has seen both wonder and horror. A land filled with life. A land filled with death. A land where the most common profession is to be a ninja. This is the elemental nation, a place where ninja rule with their power they call chakra. Chakra is the manifestation of both physical and spiritual energies coming together to form an energy that these ninja can control to do extraordinary feats like walking on walls, manipulating the elements, and even containing massive beasts inside of someone's body. Our story begins in the village of Konohamaru, or the village hidden in the leaves. This is a quiet, peaceful place where many enjoy their happy everyday lives, but things were not always like this. 12 years ago a massive nine-tailed fox appeared out of nowhere and attacked the village. It destroyed buildings, burned the forest, and killed hundreds. It truly seemed as if all was lost when the beast opened its mouth and began to charge a massive ball of chakra. Just as it was firing, the doomsday attack, the village's leader, or as they are also called Hokage, more accurately the fourth Hokage, Minato Namikaze, appeared, and in a flash the fox's attack had vanished but was soon seen again as it appeared many miles away from the village, obliterating a mountain. The Hokage saw this, and in another flash both he and the fox had also vanished. It would later be found that the Hokage had given his life to seal the beast inside of a newborn child. After this event the third Hokage, Horizon Sarutobi, took the mantle of Hokage back after his successor's death. The third was forced to reveal the infant's status as Jinchuriki in order to sat the growing paranoia from the villagers. Almost immediately after the words left his mouth there were hundreds of shouts calling for the infant's death. The third, seeing this, was greatly angered and in his rage shout that should anyone even speak of the infant's status they would be executed on the spot. He later made this law, but that didn't stop them from shunning the infant like the plague as he grew. When the child had turned 6 years old he found that he could enter the academy to learn to become a ninja. While the most agreed on age for admission is 8 years old. There is no rule that states you can't enter earlier. Sadly, due to much prejudice and just being unprepared, the child barely passed his first 3 mandatory years and has failed his graduation year twice. Our story pick up her exactly 1 month before the child's third attempt to graduate. Now you must be thinking he is studying very hard, right? Well, Naruto came and extremely annoyed and aggravated voice. Sigh, never mind. Third person POV. Oh, give up already, you're just upset you don't have the guts to do what I did, came the overzealous voice of one Naruto Uzumaki as he ran from 2 chunin who were attempting to catch him for his latest prank, which included painting the Hokage monument to make each Hokage have a ridiculously embarrassing face. Naruto allowed the chase to go on for a few more minutes before he ducked into an alley just as the chunin were coming around the corner. They ran past his hiding spot screaming his name and a number of profanities. Naruto breathed a sigh of relief and then laughed, saying, "Haha, that was too easy." "Oh yeah, Naruto," said the very angry voice of Iruka Amino, scaring the crap out of Naruto as he jumped screaming and then promptly fell on his butt. Naruto looked at Iruka and asked, "Where did you come from, Iruka-sensei? What are you doing here?" "No, what are you doing here?" came Iruka's response. "You are supposed to be in class." Naruto looked at Iruka and said, "No thanks." He then pulled out a couple of small balls and threw them to the ground, creating a smokescreen as he ran away. Naruto hid under a cart he had ran until he thought he was safe and ended up hiding in the merchant's quarters of Konoha. He breathed a sigh of relief as he found he was safe for now. Naruto slumped against the cart he was hiding under, catching his breath when he heard, "Are you okay, young one?" asked a concerned voice from behind Naruto. Naruto turned to see who was talking to him and he saw an old man, maybe in his mid-60s, wearing what he thought was a monk's robe. He had long, pure white hair reaching the bottom of his neck, but none of it covered any of his face. He had a small beard and mustache combo. "Hello, mister." "Yes, I'm fine, thank you," said Naruto, trying to be polite. "Good, now can I ask why you are hiding under my cart?" he asked, curious. Naruto then began to explain why he was there and even pointed to the mountain to show him. The old man's eyes widened at the sight before he laughed heartily. When he calmed down he looked at Naruto, who was just finishing laughing himself, and said, My boy, thank you for that. I haven't laughed that hard in many years, but I have to ask why you did it. Naruto stared at him with his eyes squinted for a moment before proclaiming, because I am going to be greater than any of them. Me, Naruto, a ninja legend. Then everyone will have to stop disrespecting me and look up to me, believe it. The old man smiled at Naruto's enthusiasm and said, you have quite the boisterous personality, don't you? Naruto looked at the man confused because he didn't know what boisterous meant, but then just smiled and nodded his head in agreement. Naruto then asked, "Oh Gigi, what do you sell anyway?" Getting curious. "Oh, that's easy, I sell musical instruments," said the old man. He quickly followed by saying, "Do you want to see some of them?" "Sure," exclaimed Naruto, excited by the prospect. "Okay, then let's go into my caravan to see the more special stuff," the old man said, smiling as he led Naruto inside. When they got inside, Naruto looked around in awe at the various instruments and how cool most of them were, which he was sure to tell the old man. The old man said, "Would you like to hear something?" "What do you mean?" asked Naruto. "Do you think I would sell these instruments without knowing how to play them?" he asked, smiling. Naruto rubbed the back of his head, embarrassed, as the old man got behind a piano that was made of a very dark wood and was very well maintained, if the shine it gave of was any indication. He began to play a sad song, but at the same time it seemed to lift all the worries and sadness from Naruto's shoulders. It continued like this for a few minutes before he stopped and turned to Naruto. He asked, "Now we just need a song to complete this. Do you have any songs or ideas in mind?" Naruto was a little surprised by his question but said, "I don't know, but I can try to come up with something." The old man smiled and said, "Very good, just sing something you think describes yourself." He then began to play again, but after a few seconds he made a clone who went to the nearest drum set. "Something more by Secondhand Serenade. This is the only song that will not have anything describing what's going on around Naruto." Naruto began to listen to the music to get a feel for it before he closed his eyes and started. "I lie awake again, my body's feeling paralyzed. I can't remember when I didn't live through this disguise. The words you said to me, they couldn't set me free. I'm stuck here in this life I didn't ask for. There must be something more. Do we know what we're fighting for?" Breath in, breath out, breath in, breath out. All these masks we wore, we never knew what we had in store. Breath in, breath out, breath in, breath out. The storm is rolling in, the thunder's loud, it hurts my ears. I'm paying for my sins, and it's gonna rain for years and years. I fooled everyone, and now what will I become? I have to start this over, I have to start this over. There must be something more. Do we know what we're fighting for? Breath in, breath out, breath in, breath out. All these masks we wore, we never knew what we had in store. Breath in, breath out, breath in, breath out. I fooled everyone, and now what will I become? I have to start this over, I have to start this over. There must be something more. Do we know what we're fighting for? Breath in, breath out, breath in, breath out. All these masks we wore, we never knew what we had in store. Breath in, breath out, breath in, breath out. There must be something more. Do we know what we're fighting for? Breath in, breath out, breath in, breath out. There must be something more. End song. As the song ended, Naruto opened his eyes to see that the old man had small tears in his eyes. Then he heard clapping and turned around to see the other merchants had come when they heard him singing and were now cheering for him. Naruto didn't know how to handle this, so he just bowed and said thank you, and as fast as they appeared they left to go back to their daily lives. The old man got up from his seat at the piano and then knelt in front of Naruto to look him in the eyes and asked, "Naruto, is that how you truly feel?" Naruto looked at him with sad eyes and said, "Yes, that is how I feel." Naruto gained an apathetic look and said, "Everyone in the village seemed to hate me for something, but I don't know what, so I started to act like an idiot, but after a while it became a habit, so eventually I forgot what I used to act like." The old man couldn't help but feel sad for Naruto and wanted to say something but allowed Naruto to continue. "When I was about to enter the academy, I had to go and buy some kunai and shuriken, but no one would sell me any, so I had to search through their trash for what I needed, and when I found some I was ecstatic, even if they were old and rusted. I was so happy I decided to go to the park and try and have fun, but when I got there all the parents immediately called their kids to leave, and the only people left were me and a father and his son." The boy asked why they had to leave, and the father said it's because I was evil and would hurt him. They both just stared at me with hateful glares and I just wanted them to stop, so the second they turned their backs I pulled out a kunai and started to run at them, but before I got halfway I fell. Both of them turned around and started to laugh at my misfortune, but when I looked at them I saw those hate-filled eyes weren't there, and it was then I decided that I would make people laugh if just to stop those eyes, and I just went with it and grew up playing pranks just to stop those glares. The old man stayed silent, processing everything Naruto had just told him. Finally Naruto asked, head bowed and crying, "Am I some sort of monster that everyone feels they have to hate?" With that Naruto sat on the ground and wrapped his arms around his legs curled into a ball. The old man didn't know what to say, so all he did was sit next to Naruto before hugging him until he had finished crying. He saw that Naruto had fallen asleep. When Naruto woke up he sat up and rubbed his eyes for a second before realizing that he wasn't in his room in his apartment but on a couch somewhere. He took a moment to collect himself and figure out what happened. When he remembered, he felt like slapping himself in the head. He ran for Maruka sensei, hid in a Gigi's merchant cart, sang as the Gigi played instruments, and told him about how he felt, cried for an hour and promptly fallen asleep. This was so embarrassing and he would never live it down. "All good, you're awake." Naruto turned to see the old man who invited him in yesterday walk in with a tray of food. He then put it down and asked, "Now are you feeling better, Naruto?" "Hi," was all Naruto said, still embarrassed. "Good," came the man's reply. After a minute of silence he decided to continue the conversation. "You have a very good singing voice." Naruto blushed but said, "Thank you." He continued, "You know, I'd be surprised a boy with a voice like yours doesn't have a girlfriend." Naruto blushed heavily but remained silent. The old man looked at Naruto and smirked but kept going, "Oh, I see you like someone, don't you?" Naruto simply nodded. The old man said, "Well, that's great, but far be it from me to pry any further into your personal life." Naruto said, "Thank you." "For what?" asked the old man. Naruto smiled slightly and said, "For caring." This broke the old man's heart to hear someone as young as Naruto to say that, but it also made him happy that he could give this child some happiness. Naruto then remembered something. "Oh, Gigi." "Yes, Naruto?" asked the old musician. "What was that just you used yesterday?" Naruto asked, very curious. "What do you mean?" the Gigi asked in return. "The clone one. I mean, I am pretty sure that clones aren't supposed to be solid," asked Naruto. "Oh, that one, that my boy was the shadow clone. It creates a solid clone, but its main purpose is for infiltration or to spy on people, because whatever the clone learns the creator gains when it dispels." He explained, only to get a blank look on Naruto's face, so he continued, "Let me explain it another way. Say you have the clone read a book. When the clone goes poof, then you will know everything the clone learned from the book." This time a look of understanding appeared on Naruto's face along with stars in his eyes. "That is so cool. Can you teach me that, just you? I mean, if I learn it I can finally graduate. I haven't been able to before because of the stupid regular Bushin no just to wait. If you're a merchant, how do you know just you?" stated Naruto, excited at first then confused towards the end. "Starting with your last question first, I am actually a retired shinobi, and for you to learn this technique you need a massive amount of chakra to use it effectively, so first I have to see if you have a large enough reserve," the old man explained. "Okay, so how do we do that?" asked Naruto excitedly. "Well, I was actually a pretty good sensor when I was younger, so I should still be able to get at least a decent reading on your chakra level. So all you have to do is focus your chakra and then I will read it and give you an answer," he responded. "Okay," said Naruto as he formed the ram seal, closed his eyes, and began to focus, even though it looked more like he was constipated. The old musician began to focus as well, though he at least looked normal while doing it, but what he saw shocked him. Naruto's chakra levels were off the charts by anyone's standards. Heck, he could literally see the chakra flowing off of Naruto without trying to sense anything. He stopped Naruto and said, "My boy, you have more chakra in you than I have ever seen in anyone, and if what I just saw was any indication, then it's no wonder you can't do the regular Bushin no just you. It requires so little chakra to perform, but you have so much it would be impossible to get that small amount." Naruto stared at him in wonder. He had finally found out why he couldn't do a freaking clone was because he had too much chakra. Naruto then asked, "So does that mean?" "Yes, Naruto, I will teach you the just you. Sadly, I won't be able to do it in person," he replied solemnly. Naruto asked, "Why not?" The old musician replied, "Because the caravan I travel with is leaving tomorrow, so I must go with it." Naruto looked down sad now that he had finally found someone other than the Hokage, Ichiraku's, and Iruka's sensei that was nice to him, and now they had to leave. Now what's with that sad look, Naruto? Asked the old musician. You have to leave, that means I won't see you again, said Naruto in a depressed tone. The old man looked at Naruto and said, Who said I would be gone forever? Naruto instantly shot up and stared at him as he continued, This caravan comes through every year, so I'll be sure to see you again. Naruto was now happy cause even though it wouldn't be on a regular basis he would be able to see this man again. Then he realized something, wait, this entire time I've been here I never bothered to ask your name. The old man blinked and realized he was right before he smiled and said, Well, what do you know, you are right, that simply won't do. He then began to walk towards his shop area with Naruto walking beside him. When they got there he said, Now before I tell you my name I want to give you something. Naruto blinked and asked, Why do you want to do that? He smirked and said, Think of it as a goodbye present and I won't take no for an answer. Naruto frowned and said, Well, since you already said you would be back next year, let's make it a see you later present, he finished with a grin. The old musician chuckled and said, A much better idea. Anyway, I want you to take any one of these instruments. Naruto stared at him in shock and asked, Is that really okay? The old musician smiled and said, I am very sure, Naruto, in fact any of these could actually help you with your ninja career. Naruto was curious now and asked, How could an instrument help me and be a ninja? Easy, each of these instruments is custom made with several different seals to make them much more efficient and durable. They only show up when you charge chakra into them. Now choose which one you want, he finished while gesturing to his merchandise. Naruto nodded and began to browse looking for something that called to him. He passed several impressive instruments which included guitars, drums, even things like tubas. However, Naruto came to a stop when he saw something it felt like it was made for him. He reached out and grabbed a longer than average flute. It was made of glass and decorated by a burnt orange stained glass fox running across its length. Naruto was so entranced by its beauty that he didn't even notice the old musician come up behind him before he spoke. It seems you have an eye for the special. This flute is truly one of my greatest works. Naruto's eyes never left the flute when he asked, Is it really okay? The musician rolled his eyes and said, Yes, Naruto, it is okay just as long as you promise me that by the time I come back you have learned how to play it. Naruto looked at him with a wide grin and said, I promise. So what's its name? The old musician suggested, I think it's appropriate that you name it. Naruto nodded and thought for a moment before saying, Tengoku no Kitsune. The old musician contemplated, Heaven's Fox? I think it's a fine name and very fitting. He then tapped Naruto on the shoulder and said, Now let's get you some instructions to help you get started. Naruto smiled at the old musician, happy as they got the supplies. While they were doing this though, Naruto asked, Can you tell me what the seals on Heaven's Fox do? The old musician smirked and said, Nope. Think of this as incentive to study some fuinjutsu. Naruto pouted but perked up fast enough when he got the supplies. Things like how to play books, more complex song sheets, and even blank music sheets for when he made his own music. The old musician placed them all in a large box, but unknown to Naruto he placed something else in there as a bonus. After hanging out a few more hours and getting a few tips on how to play, Naruto had to leave, but as he was leaving the old musician said, Now time to tell you my name, Naruto. Naruto looked at him, happy to finally know the name of the man who was helping him. My name is Demix, now go and become great, finished Demix with a proud smile as he knew Naruto would. Naruto only increased his opinion of this when as he ran off he shouted, Don't worry, I will all become the strongest ninja using music, believe it. Half an hour later, being as it was Saturday and Naruto didn't have academy today, he immediately went to the nearest training ground to begin training to be the best. Okay, so the first thing I'll do is learn the shadow clone just you, since I still need a clone just you to pass the graduation test. And train he did. It took about 2 or 3 hours, but Naruto did succeed in mastering the shadow clone just you. He really wanted to spam the just you right now and make as many clones as he could, but remembered what Demix had warned him, that too many clone at once could give him a major headache if not knock him out cold. So Naruto took a minute to rest before he got up and made 20 clones 5 at a time, and using the training schedule he and Demix separated them. 10 went to the library to read up on fuinjutsu and other topic, while under the henge just you to disguise themselves since the librarian wouldn't let him in. The next 9 would work on chakra control by using the instructions for tree walking or climbing. The last clone would begin to practice using Tengoku no Kitsune by going over the basics. Finally, the real Naruto would be working out constantly. Things like push-ups, sit-ups, running, and lifting. A month later, Naruto was currently walking through the village on his way to the academy to take the graduations exam for the 3rd time. Over the last month, Naruto had made leaps and bounds training. Overall, he could pass as a high genin to low chunin as of right now, which was a major improvement. However, yesterday during his training, his beloved jumpsuit met an unfortunate demise courteously of an overexcited clone charging too much chakra way too close to the original Naruto and exploding, though that was a fun idea that Naruto added to his Just You vault. After this incident, Naruto was forced to use the henge Justu to disguise himself and enter the nearest shinobi shop. After searching for an hour, Naruto had found a new look. He had chosen black combat boots, bleached white pants, the same colored white shirt, but it had a black tribal design of Kyuubi, who appeared to be standing or rising out of the flames that lined the bottom of his shirt. Next, he had another bleached white article of clothing, only it was a trench coat that was completely void of any detail, and to top it off, Naruto found something that terrified the shop owner. Even though the owner didn't know who he was because of his disguise, the image of horror was complete when Naruto put on a leather black fox mask that had white lines enhancing its features, but it only covered the upper half of his face. Go to Google and type in demon fox leather mask, then replace the red with white. Seriously, it should be like the first thing you see. Altogether, Naruto was happy with his new outfit as it made him feel like more of a badass. That, and he had a surprisingly civil conversation with the reason he was hated. Flashback 2 weeks. Naruto was busy training, well, maybe not training per se, but Demix had suggested that Naruto meditate in order to help himself focus because, as Demix had said, a scatter-brained ninja is a dead ninja. However, Naruto's reminiscing was cut short as he felt something tug on his mind as if asking him to answer it. Now, while Naruto had gained a fair amount of knowledge, he was still him and didn't bother to think about his actions as he decided to answer the unknown call and promptly fall unconscious. Naruto's mindscape. Naruto groaned as he sat up and rubbed his head, unsure of what had just happened, but he could see that he wasn't in the training ground. In fact, he doubted he was in Konoha anymore. Naruto stood up to see that he was in some form of oversized sewer. As Naruto took in his surroundings, he heard something. "Come to me," a giant disembodied voice called. Now Naruto did know that it was probably a very bad idea to follow a voice that sounded like it came from a behemoth-sized person or creature, but he needed answers and the voice was the only thing around at the moment, so Naruto walked for what seemed like hours but was really a few minutes until he came to an immensely large room with what looked like a giant gate. "So you have come," came the voice Naruto heard earlier. He looked around but was unable to find the source until the voice made itself known again. "Here's an idea, look up." Naruto did as told and looked up to see behind the gate was a massive fox who was leaning his head on one of his paws while staring at Naruto with his 9 tails shifting lazily around. "Hello kid, as you probably know I am Kyuubi," said Kyuubi in a voice that sounded very bored and somewhat annoyed, but mostly bored. Kyuubi," shouted Naruto as he stared at the massive fox with a what the fuck look on his face. "Yeah, I am the mighty Kyuubi no Kitsune. One swing of my great tails can crush mountains and create tsunamis," Kyuubi replied in a detached and slightly sarcastic voice, all the while cleaning his claws, never bothering to even look at Naruto. Naruto, who had regained some composure, simply stared at the kitsune with a confused look now and finally asked, "What's eating you?" Kyuubi raised an eyebrow and looked at Naruto, then he said, "Really, that's the first thing you want to know?" It was a statement rather than an inquiry. Naruto shrugged his shoulders. "Well, it's a good enough place to start," he said, having completely regained his composure. Kyuubi blinked, having not expected this, and asked, "Are you serious?" He just couldn't fully comprehend what was going on. Naruto continued, "Oh, don't get me wrong, of course I have other questions I want answered, but that doesn't mean that I should go shouting them off all at once." "You are interesting, kid," Kyuubi said after a few minutes of silence. "I'm glad you think so. Now back to my question. What is eating you?" asked Naruto, trying to get back on topic. Kyuubi sighed before using his arms as a pillow and laying his head on them and said in a slightly whiny voice, "I'm bored," he said, this extending the word bored as if to stress the meaning. Bored? Was all Naruto said as a sweet drop fell from his head. Yup, was all Kyuubi said. Naruto then asked, why are you bored? Kyuubi gave Naruto a ****ing me look and said, seriously, you try being trapped in a cage for over 100 years with nothing to do but sleep and then tell me how you feel. Yeah, I guess that would get old quick, said Naruto as he rubbed his head. Then he realized something. Wait, over 100 years? How, you just attacked the village like almost 12 years ago? Kyuubi looked at him and gave a small grow as he said, to answer your question first I have to tell you where we are. Naruto nodded his compliance. Well, to start, we are in your mind and we are here because your Yodem Hokage sealed me into you during that attack those few years ago. Well, fuck my life, mumbled Naruto as he held his head to try and stem the growing headache. You said it, not me, replied Kyuubi in a nonchalant voice. But I digress. Back on topic. Before I was sealed in you, I was sealed in your mother. At the mention of the word mother, Naruto shot up and screamed, my mother. Kyuubi sighed as he had expected this. Yes, your mother, Kushina Uzumaki, was my previous Jinchuriki. Back to the story. During your birth, a masked man, who from what I could tell was an Uchiha due to the fact he had a Sharingan, ripped me from her seal and hypnotized me, forcing me to attack your village and in the process kill your parents as they jumped in front of my claw, impaling them but stopping me from killing you. Naruto looked at Kyuubi and said, that explains a lot, and thank you for telling me my mother's name, I really appreciate it. Kyuubi gave a small nod and smiled, then told Naruto, you're welcome, kid. Now on two more pressing matters. What are you going to do now? Well, I plan on becoming the best ninja in the world and making my parents proud, replied Naruto, fully convinced that he would. Kyuubi raised an eyebrow and asked, while that's all well and good, what do you mean parents? I never mentioned who your father was. Naruto gave Kyuubi a grin and said, you didn't need to, you dropped enough hints that I could piece it together. I mean, based on what I know about him, he would never sacrifice someone's child if he couldn't sacrifice his own. You're a lot more perceptive than you let on, finished Kyuubi with his own grin. Naruto smirked and said, thanks. Now my next question, what's your name? Kyuubi tensed a little and lowered his head to look at Naruto in the eyes and ask, what do you mean? Naruto gave a sad smile. I have heard many stories of the Biju and in each of them you are seen as monsters, but if you reverse the situation, how many times have you had to fight just to remain free? How many times have you been forced to kill to protect yourself? How many times have you had to deal with being called monster, beast, even demon? Naruto walked up to Kyuubi and put a hand on his big black nose and asked, how many times, Kyuubi? Kyuubi gained a distant look as he remembered all the times since he was born or created, depending on your view, that he was forced to run or to attack, but the one that stood out the most happened when he was only a kid, and it was actually the one of the only ones that didn't involve death. Kyuubi's flashback. Oto-san, what are we doing here? Asked a very young Kyuubi as he walked with his father, the Sage of Six Paths. Kyuubi looked as he always did, only he was much smaller, only just shorter than the sage himself. The sage gave his child a small smile and said, we are here to get some food for our family, my child. Why, my siblings and I don't need it, said a confused Kyuubi, although he was also excited as this was the first time he would see a human village. The sage laughed and said, just because you don't need it doesn't mean you don't have to have it. Kyuubi remained confused at his father's words but smiled at his laughter. He even joined in by laughing right with him. Over the next few hours they both entered the village's market, gaining many looks. Kyuubi noticed that the people looked at his father with awe and respect, but when he saw how they looked at him he felt scared. They glared at him like they wanted him to die, but what had he done? And even though they didn't know it, he could hear when they whispered monster, beast, demon. All he knew is that he didn't like it, so he did the first thing that came to mind and hid behind his father for the rest of the day, not looking if he could help it. They went about their business for a few more hours and Kyuubi tried to stay hidden, but when the children of the village wanted to see him, thinking he was cool, but their parents shut this idea down, saying that he was dangerous and would hurt them. Kyuubi was appalled at this thought. He loved children, heck, he hoped take care of the sage's newborn children. When they were a good distance away from the village, Kyuubi stopped and stared at the ground with a glum look. The sage turned to see his son's glum expression. He was well aware of what the villagers had said and done, but violence was never the answer, so he just got what they needed as fast as possible so they could leave and he could comfort his child. So he asked, are you okay, my child? Kyuubi slowly raised his head to show the sage that tears were running down his face. He reached around his father and hugged him before crying into his chest, asking, "Why? Why did they say those things? Why do they glare at me? Why did they call me those names? Why?" The sage hugged his son back and said, "They did and said those things because they don't understand." Kyuubi looked at his father and mumbled through a choked sob, "They don't know me. They didn't even ask what my name was." The sage smiled sadly and told his child, "That's right, my child. Please don't cry, I do not like to see my children sad." With that he wiped the tears from Kyuubi's eyes and gave him a smile. Kyuubi sniffled but smiled, "If just a little. That's my boy," said the sage in a quiet but proud voice filled with love. "Now come on, we have to head home." "Hi daddy," grinned Kyuubi as he let go of his father and they walked home, but as they walked Kyuubi asked a question, "Tusan?" "Yes?" asked the sage. "What do I do if someone does ask me for my name?" asked Kyuubi. The sage smiled and said, "Well, when they ask for your name, the best thing to do is tell it to them and then be friendly. Hopefully they will become one of, if not your best friend. Does that answer your question?" Kyuubi grinned and said, "Hi Tusan." The sage nodded and said, "Now let's go home, Kurama," as they walked over the hill and out of sight. Flashback end. Kyuubi looked at Naruto and said, "More times than I would like to remember." Naruto nodded and then asked, "What about my other question? What's your name?" Kyuubi smiled and said, "My name is Kurama." Naruto grinned and told him, "Well, it's nice to meet you, Kurama." "It's nice to meet you as well, Naruto," replied Kurama with a grin. "So while ideal chit-chat is fun and all, is there a way for me to keep in contact with you when I'm not here?" asked Naruto. "As far as I know, if you want it to happen it will," answered Kurama. "So friends?" asked Naruto with his hand extended. Kurama smiled and let Naruto take hold of his claw. "Friends." "Sweet," finished Naruto. With that he woke up, but not before leaving Kurama a little present in the form of Naruto wanting to change his mindscape to look like a home Kurama would want to live in. It changed so that the walls looked like they belonged in a log cabin, all the water drained, a fireplace appeared close by, and Kurama was now lying on a very comfortable rug. What Naruto didn't know was he had given Kurama the one thing he had always wanted: a friend. Flashback end. As Naruto walked towards the academy, he thought of the other things he had learned over the month. First, after going over what the clones he had sent to the library had learned, he found that they had given basic knowledge of most subjects like math, history, and so on. But then came the cool information came flowing in. First of all, he learned of some other forms of chakra control such as water walking that he had his clones do, and needless to say they succeeded after a few days. Then one clone decided to read up on different music-related subjects and actually found a book about what music was, and it said that music is vocal or instrumental sound, or both, used to express emotion or create harmony. So when the clone read this, it thought, what if I found a way to use sound itself? Thus Naruto began to send more clones to find more information on sound and its qualities so that he could find some way to use it in battle. From what the clones read, sound is classified as the vibrations or waves in the air that act on a medium, normally the air. So after a while and the use of a dictionary, Naruto found that if something shakes fast enough it makes sound. So now Naruto was trying to find a way to enhance vibrations to the point they can hurt someone. Little is needed to say Naruto hasn't had much success as of now, but that doesn't mean he hasn't succeeded at all. So far the farthest he had gotten in practical use was using his voice box to create a loud roar, but he was still learning more about the subject. One clone tried to find some form of taijutsu they could use but was unable to because he wasn't a ninja yet. He couldn't enter the ninja section. This confused him. Why were there chakra exercises in the civilian section then? But since he couldn't find any, he then looked to see if there were any journals or something that had something he could try to recreate. The clone was having little luck until he found a book of legendary fighter. Most were fake as it was more of a fairy tale book, but one thing caught his eye. There was a hero that had a very detailed fighting style. Apparently the author wanted it to seem as realistic as possible. The hero was able to bend his body in impossible ways to dodge attack. He could harden his body to mimic iron, disappear in a burst of speed, send projectiles with a kick, jump off of air. Hell, he could poke holes into people with his fingers. Naruto really wanted to do some of, if not all, these things, so he got to work. Only he tried to center it around the style he was creating. He had a little luck as he tried to recreate it, but this was only with Kurama's help, as he gave Naruto a boost in his senses so he could hear the sound vibrations and ride them, so to speak, to dodge some attacks. It still wasn't anywhere near perfect, but it was an improvement. That being said, he hadn't even touched the other abilities. Note: this means that while they will have the same abilities, I'm just going to change the name some of if not all the powers and create some logic to make them sound plausible. Smiley face. Now other clones did some more practical training for the time being. If Naruto was tested, he would be told that his chakra control was around high genin level, which is a major improvement to what it was. Fuinjutsu was something Naruto actually enjoyed. Demix had said it was one of the hardest styles of Jutsu, but Naruto actually loved to study it. That's not to say he could make any seal he wanted, but he could figure out what a good few of them could do. For instance, when Naruto examined the seals on Tengoku no Kitsune, he found that there was a durability seal that made the glass as strong as a very high-grade steel. There were also some genjutsu seals that actually allowed Naruto to be able to use genjutsu. They were still low-level ones, but that was fine by Naruto. There were also a seal that helped the wielder control and bend wind to attack or defend. There were a few more seals, but Naruto hadn't gotten far enough in his studying to determine what they did yet. Finally, in regards to his new favorite hobby, which was his flute Tengoku no Kitsune, Naruto had made leaps and bounds. He found that he had an almost a natural talent for the instrument and quickly blew through the how to play book and then learned a good few songs. He had even come up with a few just you with it. Let's not forget the clone that went to the academy. He slept the entire month. Academy. I'm writing this expecting you to know what each character looks like. I won't say anything unless I change an outfit or personality. Naruto decided to wait to show his new look at team orientation, so for now he cast a henge to disguise himself as his old orange-wearing self. Naruto walked into his classroom with a few minutes to spare and looked around to see that the rest of his classmates were here. Naruto also saw that there were no chairs left as far as he could tell until he heard a small voice. "Hey Anyo, there's a seat here, Naruto-kun." Naruto turned to see his classmate Hinata Hyuga sitting in the back row of the class. He smiled and walked up to her and sat down while telling her with a smile, "Thank you, Hinata-chan." Hinata turned beet red at Naruto calling her Chan, but returned the smile just as Iruka and Mizuki walked in. Iruka looked up at his students and said, "All right then, welcome everybody. Today we will be having the graduation exam. As such, there will be 3 parts: weapons, taijutsu, and ninjutsu, which will consist of the Academy 3. Is that understood?" After receiving a call of, "Hi sensei," he nodded and said, "Good, now let's go outside for the weapons portion." The weapons portion went well. Naruto hadn't really done much with this over the last month, but still scored a respectable 7 out of 10 on both kunai and shuriken. The clan heirs scored anywhere from about the same, with the civilian children getting lower scores. Next was the taijutsu portion. Iruka spoke up, "Alright, we're about to get started in this test. Now here is how it will go. When I call your name, you will come up and try to beat either me or Mizuki, or last for 3 minutes minimum, understood?" "Hi sensei," replied the class. "Good, first up Shino Aburame," called Iruka. It continued like this for the next hour, with kids from clans doing much better than the civilians. Naruto went and sat under a tree to wait for his turn, only to see Shikamaru had beaten him there and was already fast asleep. Naruto chuckled as he waited. Then it came, "Naruto Uzumaki," shouted Iruka, calling Naruto to the ring. When Naruto got there, he found he was fighting Mizuki. Naruto got into his stance, which included his arms at his side and his legs shoulder-width apart while slightly bent. "What kind of stance is that? You're full of openings," mocked Mizuki, thinking this would be over quick. Hell, the class, mostly Sasuke's fangirls, shudders, and the civilian kids were cheering for Mizuki to beat him up. Iruka wanted to say something but knew he couldn't hold the match any longer, so he said, "Begin." Mizuki vs Naruto. Mizuki was off like a light. He rushed at Naruto at a noticeably higher speed than when he fought the other students, aiming a punch straight for Naruto's face. Naruto didn't want to reveal his only technique quite yet, so he dodged to the best of his ability. When the punch was about to hit, Naruto ducked and tried to sweep Mizuki's legs out from under him. Mizuki saw this and jumped over the sweep before spinning to axe kick Naruto, but Naruto jumped out of the way just as the kick landed. Naruto aimed a punch at Mizuki's unguarded back. Sadly, Mizuki sensed it coming and back flipped over Naruto. Naruto gained his balance before Mizuki landed. Naruto looked at the timer to see there was less than a minute left, so he decided to just wait it out. Mizuki landed and was about to attack but stopped when he saw Naruto was just standing there, so he decided to try and taunt Naruto. "What, is that all you got?" Naruto made no sound as he raised his hand and made a come and get some motion. Mizuki pissed at Naruto's discharged, but when he threw the first punch Naruto said, "Current," Naruto dodged the attack like it was nothing. Mizuki, seeing Naruto dodge, picked up the pace and threw a lot more punches at various speeds, though some managed to graze Naruto but none made any real contact. This was what was brilliant about Naruto's technique in the story. The hero made his body go limp so he could ride the air current that every attack made, but what few know is that with the air current there is also a sound current, and that is what Naruto used to dodge. The class stared in shock at seeing Naruto the dead last dodge Chunin level taijutsu moves. Their shock was ended by the sound of a buzzer. Iruka snapped out of his funk at seeing Naruto's skill and called, "Stop. The match is done." Naruto nodded to Mizuki and left the ring. Iruka said, "Okay, now that match is done, Ino, you're next." Ino didn't last long, but still longer than the civilians. That's how they found themselves back in the classroom waiting to be called to do the ninjutsu portion of the exam in the next room over. Naruto went back to sit by Hinata and say good luck when her turn came. Naruto waited for his turn. Finally Iruka came in and called for him, so he got up and left for the exam room. Exam room. When Naruto entered the room he stood in front of Iruka and Mizuki. Iruka said, "Okay Naruto, to pass this portion you must complete the henge, substitute, and bushin jutsu." "Hi sensei," replied Naruto. "Okay, henge first," instructed Iruka. "Henge," said Naruto, who was covered in smoke. As the smoke cleared, Iruka and Mizuki saw someone. A man about 6'2" stood where Naruto had. He had silver, gray hair that spiked but had two distinct horn-like spikes in the front. He wore a white trench coat that had a red circle with smaller circles in it above 9 magatama lined up 3 by 3. Much like the necklace he wore, he was carrying a kakara, or a Japanese priest's staff. But the most stunning thing were his eyes. They purple and had the same concentrated circles in them. Other than that he wore basic cloths like a t-shirt and white pants. Iruka asked, "Naruto, who is this?" Naruto stared at him and said, "Has time been so destructive that one who is to educate the young would not know he who saved the world from the Jubi?" Mizuki fainted then and there, whereas Iruka gasped and said, "Naruto, please undo this transformation now." "What are you talking about, sensei?" came Naruto's voice from beside him. Iruka turned to find Naruto standing in the corner of the room where he was sure a chair was before. Iruka turned back and forth between Naruto and the sage a few times before his eyes rolled back into his head and he joined Mizuki in a state of blissful unconsciousness. A few minutes later he woke up to find Naruto sitting in front of him in a chair with a sly grin on his face. Iruka rubbed his head before saying, "Okay Naruto, you defiantly pass. You used all three, just you, in quick succession, but I have a couple of questions." Naruto nodded and said, "Fire away sensei." "Hey, that rhymed." Iruka chuckled and asked, "Okay, first, that wasn't a normal clone, that was a shadow clone. How did you find that just you?" "Oh, that's easy. After I escaped from you last month I ran into a retired shinobi who, after testing my chakra levels, saw that I had way too much chakra to even attempt a regular bushin, so he showed me the shadow clone as an alternative," replied Naruto with a grin. "Okay, that explains that. Now my next question, why did you transform into the Sage of Six Paths and how did you get a description to work with anyway?" asked Iruka. Naruto smiled and said, "That actually took time. See, I did it just because I wanted to, but as for the description, I looked at every myth and legend I could for his description, then I just took the traits that showed up the most and came up with what you saw. That, and Kurama is a very detailed storyteller. Thank you for telling me all those stories, Kurama." "You're welcome, Kit," came Kurama's reply from his mind. Iruka stared off into space and said, "That actually sounds logical and well thought out." He then turned to look at Naruto and said, "Who are you and what have you done with Naruto?" Naruto whined a little and said, "That's not nice, sensei." Iruka laughed and said, "True. But anyway, here you go, Naruto." He grabbed a headband and handed it to Naruto with a proud smile. "Congratulations, Naruto, you graduate." Naruto smiled and hugged Iruka, saying, "Thank you, Iruka sensei." He then took the headband and tied it around his neck. Iruka said, "You're welcome, Naruto." Naruto grinned and ran out of the room, heading for the courtyard, hoping Hinata was still there so he could show her. Naruto had decided that during the small amount of time he had spent with her today, he wanted to be her friend. As Naruto entered the courtyard he saw a large group of people, most parents congratulating their children. As Naruto searched for Hinata he heard the parents whisper, Why did they let him become a ninja? Don't they care what happens when he gets stronger? Before another could even answer, the first Naruto tuned them out and continued on his search for a minute before his effort bore some fruit. Naruto walked up behind Hinata and said, "Hey Hinata-chan." Naruto got a surprised "Eep" as his response before she turned around, looked at him, turned red, then gained a smile at seeing his headband was tied the same way hers was. Hello Naruto-kun," she said timidly while poking her fingers together. "Hinata, would you mind introducing me and your sister to your friend?" asked a man who Naruto could only assume was Hinata's father. "Hi Oto-sama. Naruto-kun, this is my Oto-sama Hiyashi Hyuga, and this is my younger sister Hanabi Hyuga," stated Hinata with only a few stutters. Naruto ignored the stutters and raised his hand to shake Hiyashi's while saying, "Hello, I'm Naruto Uzumaki, it's nice to meet you Hyuga-sama." Hiyashi, somewhat surprised at Naruto's politeness, shook Naruto's hand and said, "Likewise Uzumaki-san, now may I ask why you have come to see my daughter?" Naruto, completely oblivious to the hidden meaning, said, "Yes sir. I wanted to know if I could train with her over the next 2 weeks until team assignments." Hiyashi thought for a moment before he nodded and said, "I will approve of this if Hinata wants to." "Yes," shouted Hinata, surprising everyone in the vicinity, all of whom stared at her as she turned a ridiculous shade of red and said, Anyo IW would like that very much Naruto-kun." Hiyashi, snapping out of his shock, said, "Great, now then starting tomorrow you may both train together in the clan's compound unless there is somewhere else you had in mind Uzumaki-san." Naruto shook his head to confirm it was fine. "Very well, we shall see you tomorrow around 9 in the morning. Have a good day Uzumaki-san," finished Hiyashi. "You and your daughters as well Hyuga-sama," said Naruto with a bow. Naruto watched as Hinata and her family walked away. When they were out of view, he turned to see that most of the crowd had dispersed, so he decided to go sit on the old swing for a minute and wait for everyone to leave before he did. As he was sitting, he was having a conversation with a certain fox. "So you're sure there's nothing wrong with training at the Hyuga's compound?" "Yup. As far as I know there is nothing bad about training there," replied Kurama. "Okay then, wait, here comes Mizuki-sensei, talk to you later Kurama," said Naruto. "Okay kid, talk to you later, but be careful, something doesn't feel right about this guy," warned Kurama. "Thanks for the warning," finished Naruto. If there was one thing Naruto had learned to trust this last month, it was Kurama's intuition. It had saved him from a pack of wolves, a stampede of deer, and even a bear. The stampede was Naruto's fault though, since he was the one who let them out of their pens at the Nara compound. But how was he supposed to know that the Nara were too lazy to catch their own deer? "Hello Naruto," said Mizuki as he smiled down at Naruto. "Hey Mizuki-sensei," replied Naruto curtly. Mizuki bent down to look at Naruto in the eyes and said, "I wanted to congratulate you on graduating, but you ran off before I woke up. Nice prank by the way." Naruto grinned and said excitedly, "Thanks sensei, I trained real hard for the last month so that I could finally pass." Mizuki said, "I could tell from what I saw, but I also came with a message from the Hokage." This had Naruto's attention. What could Hokage Gigi want with him right now? As far as he knew, the only prank he had pulled was the one in the exam room? So Naruto asked, "What is it?" Mizuki told him, "Well, he told me that you did so well, he is offering you a chance to help him. He needs to find any security holes in the village, so he wants you to stage a robbery of a fake of a specific scroll found in his library and get to this location." With that, he took out a slip of paper and handed it to Naruto. "You're to get to this location with the scroll by midnight tonight if you accept, understood?" Naruto paused and thought for a minute. Everything he said sounded at least somewhat plausible, but something didn't feel right. Add that with Kurama's intuition, and Naruto felt there was something up. He would have to speak with Gigi about this. Naruto lifted his head and smiled before exclaiming, "Heck yeah, I'll help sensei." Mizuki smirked and said, "Good, then I will meet you when the time comes later Naruto." With that he left. Naruto read what was on the paper before taking off towards the Hokage's office. Reception area. Naruto walked up to the receptionist before asking, "Is the Hokage free right now?" The receptionist looked at Naruto and then said in a nice voice, "1 second, let me see." With that she got up and knocked on the office door before walking in. She walked out a few seconds later and turned to him and said, "The Hokage will see you now," before walking back to her desk. Naruto grinned at her and said, "Thank you," before walking into the office. Hokage's office. Ah, Naruto-kun, what brings you here today? Asked the aged Hokage Hiruzen Sarutobi. Then he saw the headband around his neck and smiled before saying, "Congratulations Naruto-kun, you finally graduated." "Thanks Gigi," exclaimed Naruto as he walked towards the Hokage's desk. When he got right in front of the desk and asked, "Gigi, I wanted to ask something." Hiruzen smiled and said, "Ask away." With a wave of the hand. Naruto nodded and said, "Okay, I'll be blunt. Did you ask Mizuki-sensei to ask me to find security risks by staging a robbery of a fake forbidden scroll?" Hiruzen was definitely surprised by the question but quickly went into Hokage mode and asked, "Naruto, I never did such a thing. Now as you said Mizuki asked you to do this, I guess you know what that means, right Naruto?" Naruto nodded and said, "Hi, as much as I don't like to say it, Mizuki must be a traitor." Hiruzen nodded back and said, "Yes, now tell me all the details of your encounter with Mizuki." Naruto nodded and proceeded to relay everything that happened in as much detail as he could remember to the Hokage. When he finished, he looked at the Hokage, who was stroking his beard, and thought. When Hiruzen had finished thinking, he gained a wicked smirk and said, "Naruto, I have a plan and it requires your help." Naruto nodded and said, "Hi Hokage-sama." Meeting place. Naruto was currently sitting in the middle of the woods waiting for Mizuki to show up and take the bait, but as he waited a thought came to his mind in the form of Kurama, who said, "Naruto, you still have an hour or two before he is supposed to get here, why not see if you can learn another technique?" Naruto thought this over for a minute and thought back, "That actually sound like a really good idea, thanks for that." "Welcome, let me know if you need help," finished Kurama. "Okay," finished Naruto as he began to unravel the scroll and search through it. He came on a couple of cool just you that he wanted to learn but knew he couldn't remember all of them, so he asked Kurama to help and memorized them as best he could, and that was very well thanks to his photographic memory. 2 hours had passed and Naruto had entered the clearing, and it had been 90 minutes since he first heard the village's alarms. So far Naruto had learned one just you but with a twist to it. So now he was just waiting. Naruto. Looks like his wait was over. Naruto turned to see Iruka looking at him angry and tried to defuse the situation while also giving Iruka an idea of what was going on by saying, "Hi Iruka-sensei, did Mizuki-sensei send you here instead?" As he said this he tied the scroll to his back. Naruto, of all the irresponsible, idiotic. Iruka stopped here as what Naruto asked registered in his mind. Naruto just said Mizuki asked him to meet here, but that means. Iruka heard something and screamed, "Naruto, look out." He pushed Naruto away but was hit by a dozen kunai and pinned to a tree. "Ah, Iruka, figures you would beat me here," came the voice of Mizuki, who was standing on a tree limb about 20 feet above Naruto and Iruka. Iruka looked at Mizuki and shouted, "Mizuki, what is the meaning of this? Why did you trick Naruto into stealing the scroll?" Mizuki sent him an arrogant grin and boasted, "Isn't it obvious, Iruka? I had him steal it so that I could take it and become more powerful." He then turned towards Naruto and said, "Now Naruto, give me the scroll." Naruto stood from where Iruka had pushed him, and when he was standing up he inclined his head slightly so that he could see Mizuki and said, "Yeah, I don't think so." With that, shockwaves blew off of Naruto, quickly followed by a blinding flash of light. When Mizuki and Iruka were finally able to see again, they looked to find Naruto had changed. In the place of the orange-loving goof-off was a being who, while only a few inches taller than Naruto, wore an outfit that scared the crap out of both shinobi. He wore a pair of white pants, a white shirt with a tribal design of Kyuubi rising from out of the fire, a white trench coat on top of that completely devoid of any detail, and to top it all of a leather fox mask that covered the upper portion of his face. Rematch: Naruto vs Mizuki. Naruto, still staring at Mizuki, said, "You hurt my sensei, now you will pay." With that, the figure reached into his pocket and pulled out a flute. Mizuki glared at Naruto and said, "So you really are the Kyuubi?" quirked Naruto with a smirk. Iruka's eyes widened as Mizuki gasped and asked, "You know?" Naruto's smirk changed to a full-on grin as he said, "Of course, why wouldn't I know my best friend?" Another chorus of gasps and wide eyes. This time the Hokage and Anbu, all of who were hidden, joined in the shock. Mizuki growled as he said, "Regardless, I will end you, Kyuubi." With that, he threw his Gaint Fuma shuriken at Naruto. Naruto stared at Mizuki and said, "Are you hard of hearing? Just because we have the same body doesn't mean we are the same person." As the shuriken was closing in, Naruto waited until finally he screamed, Current. Naruto bent back as far as he could, which was just far enough to prevent the shuriken from touching his mask, and with unprecedented reaction time used his flute to catch the shuriken and redirecting it to fly back at Mizuki. Mizuki, shocked at what happened, but managed to dodge by jumping over the traitorous weapon and landing on the ground and drawing a kunai before speeding at Naruto, who stood ready to defend himself. As Mizuki went with a straight jab towards Naruto's heart, Naruto deflected the kunai with his flute. Mizuki tried the same strategy multiple times, aiming for other vital spots like the liver, jugular, even his brain, but nothing got through that thrice damned flute. Finally Mizuki disengaged by jumping back before yelling, "How is a glass flute able to defend against my kunai?" Naruto smirked and said, "Ever heard of seals?" Mizuki felt like he had been hit with a ton of bricks when he heard the answer, but had no time to berate himself as he looked at Naruto. Naruto decided this had gone on long enough and was honestly impressed. He didn't think he would have done this well. Right now he was thanking all the dodging practice he had done over the last month. Oh well, back to business. Naruto put his flute to his mouth and said just as he was about to start playing, "Genjutsu, Bringer of Darkness." Naruto then began to play some music. Play Song of the Caged Bird by Lindsey Sterling and try to pretend it's a flute version. I tried to line up the fight so you could read it with the music, so there may some problems, so be gentle, thank you. Mizuki could only watch as the world began to fade around him, leaving him in a world of darkness. The walls were pitch black as was the sky, but the floor distorted with every step he took. He armed himself with kunai in both hands and tried to listen for the source of the music, but couldn't find it as it disappeared whenever he came near it. Finally he heard something as the bass to the song dropped. A voice sounded. It said, "Futon. Windblade." Mizuki had seconds to react as the blades came into view in front of him. He was able to dodge the blades that came at his head and leg, but one caught his shoulder, cutting him deeply, and another grazed his side, drawing blood. He jumped back as far as he could, but he hit something on the way back that stopped him from proceeding backwards. But as he recoiled this time, a strong punch landed in his gut, forcing him to the ground. Before he could regain his balance, the song sped up again and he was knocked around, first by an uppercut to the chin that sent him airborne slightly off the ground but perfectly parallel as a kick was landed to his back, forcing him forward, but while he was still in the air another kick sent him to the ground, ending the barrage. As the song continued to play, the world of darkness began to dissipate, but Mizuki couldn't move as he was in a lot of pain, so he was forced to lay there and listen to Naruto's song. But as he listened, the source of the music got closer until it finished just as Naruto came into view. End song. Mizuki groaned as he looked at Naruto and forced out the word, "D-demon." With that he passed out. Naruto sighed and said with his voice returning to normal, "How many times do I have to say it? Even though we share the same body, we are not the same person, and on top of that he is not a demon." Hiruzen chuckled as he and the Anbu jumped into view. He looked at Naruto and said, "I don't think he can hear you, Naruto." "Yeah, I know, but that doesn't change the fact he's wrong," concluded Naruto with a frown. Hiruzen gave a small smile and said, "No it doesn't, but anyway, on to business." As he said this, the Anbu took Mizuki into custody and Iruka to the hospital, leaving them alone. He then turned serious and asked, "Naruto, what did you mean when you made that statement earlier?" Naruto sighed again, knowing this was coming, and said, "Just what I said, Kyuubi is my best friend." Hiruzen maintained his gaze on the boy as he said, "And what, pray tell, has it done to deserve your friendship? First of all, secondly, how did you meet it, and finally, why did you not inform me of this?" Naruto actually felt angry right now, but not for what most would think he'd be angry about. He seethed, "Kyuubi is not an it. Kyuubi is a he, and I would appreciate that he be referred to as such." Hiruzen was surprised that Naruto's anger was directed toward how he referred to Kyuubi, but said, "Very well, now please answer the questions." Naruto breathed slowly to calm himself, but soon said, "I met him while meditating about 2 weeks ago. How he gained my friendship was another story. There were actually a few main parts to this. The first was he lived my life." Hiruzen asked, "What do you mean?" confused and worried about all the different things that it could have meant. Naruto continued, "It means he lived a life similar to mine. He was hated, ostracized, and abused. He was forced to fight or run to keep his freedom. He was forced to be an unwilling weapon for this village." Naruto was glaring at the Hokage by now with a fire ignited by righteous fury over the way his friend was treated. "And you want to know what else he told me? He told me who my parents were." At hearing this last part, Hiruzen went pale and Naruto saw it, so he said, That's right, I know who they were, and as to why I didn't inform you. I know you would have wiped my mind of the event and tightened the seal to protect me. He said these words in a sarcastic tone. Hiruzen bowed his head in shame, as what Naruto said was completely true. He would have done that, but his self-pity was cut short by Naruto. Naruto had calmed down some and said, and another reason why he told me why he attacked 12 years ago. Naruto's eyes bore into the Hokage's skull as he said, he was forced to buy a masked Uchiha. Hiruzen's blood ran cold at that statement and Simple asked, are you sure? Naruto nodded as he explained, you know as well as I do. I had to learn to read people in order to survive in the village, so I know very well when someone is lying to me, and Kyuubi wasn't in the least. Hiruzen nodded as he thought over the information Naruto had given him, but quickly pushed it to the back of his mind as he dealt with the failure that had probably ruined his relationship with his grandson figure. Hiruzen said, Naruto turned towards him as he continued, while I don't deserve it and don't expect to get it, I beg you for forgiveness for all the things I have kept from you over your life and all the things that have happened to you. Naruto sighed and said, I already forgave you, Gigi. Hiruzen's head shot up at a speed Naruto expected to break his neck and asked, why? Naruto began to take off his mask. When it was fully off, Naruto said, if I can't forgive someone of their mistakes, how can I expect them to forgive me for mine? Hiruzen stared at Naruto with a proud gaze and said, you are wise beyond your years, Naruto. Naruto rubbed the back of his head and smiled, thank Gigi. Hiruzen placed a hand on Naruto's shoulder and said, now what do you say we get this back to my office? Naruto nodded and smiled and walked with the Hokage on their way back to his office. Kurama had his own thoughts to add as he said, nice show, Naruto. Naruto replied, thanks Kurama, it was nothing. Crap, I'm falling behind, talk to you later Kurama. Naruto cut the connection till later. Kurama thought, that boy is going to be great, and this is just the beginning. Episode 2. My name's Konohamaru. It has been a week since the scroll incident, and Naruto was currently having his ninja ID taken. As Naruto thought about what had happened over the last week, he laughed. The day after the incident, he had went to meet Hinata for training at her clan's compound. Flashback. Naruto was ecstatic today he would meet up with Hinata and train. It was actually the first time he would train with someone his own age that was nice to him, so he was happy. But he decided to henge himself to look like his orange self, unsure of how the guards would react to him walking up with his fox mask. When Naruto saw the gates, he walked up to the guard, who asked, what business do you have here? Naruto spoke shortly and to the point, Hirashi-sama has allowed me to come for the next 2 weeks to train with Hinata. If you need confirmation, please get either Hirashi-sama or Hinata-chan. The guard nodded as his companion went inside and returned a few minutes later and nodded before allowing him to pass through. When he entered, he was greeted by Hirashi, Hinata, and Hanabi. Naruto bowed to Hirashi, who returned the gesture. Hirashi was the first to speak and said, welcome Uzumaki-san, I trust you didn't have any trouble getting here. Naruto replied with, none whatsoever, Hirashi-sama. Hirashi nodded and said, very well, shall we proceed to the training fields? Naruto nodded and they began to walk towards the fields. To finish the story, Naruto had asked Hinata to help him improve his current ability, but Hinata eventually managed to hit him a few times, shutting down his tenketsu and forcing him to drop his henge. The moment Hinata saw what he looked like now, she passed out with a loud eep and massive nosebleed. But that wasn't all he got out of training with them. He saw that the Jiyuken fighting style bore a resemblance to the fighting style the hero used. When he asked Hinata what it did exactly, he found that a Jiyuken user channels chakra with pinpoint accuracy to close their opponent's tenketsus to stop the flow of chakra. This gave Naruto an idea of how to copy the hero's style. He thought if he got better with sound, then he could create a pointed barrier around his fingers and then stab his enemies. Over the rest of the week, they had both trained and gotten closer to each other, both considered the other one of their best friends, and nothing would change that. Naruto smiled at the memory as he sat in the Hokage's office just talking to the old man, since he had plenty of free time today, still in his orange outfit. He had to cancel training today since both he and Hinata had to get their ids. But he and the Hokage were regaling each other of their week's experiences. The door to the Hokage's office flew open and a kid ran in with a kunai screaming, "This time I'll get you, old man." The kid was around 8 years old. He wore a baggy yellow shirt with the leaf symbol on it, brown shorts that reached his mid-femur, standard ninja shoes, He had a strange helmet that had an orange frowning face on one side with his hair coming out in a poof at the top, and he had a ridiculously long scarf. Speaking of said scarf, the kid tripped on it, landing on his face in between Naruto and the Hokage. When the kid picked himself up, his face was red and his eyes watering. He looked around the room and saw the Hokage and Naruto while trying to figure out how he feel. He then said the only logical thing that came to his mind by jumping up, pointed at Naruto, and screaming, "Hey, you tripped me." Naruto looked around to see if anyone else was around where the kid was pointing. When he didn't see anybody, he pointed to himself and asked, "Do you mean me?" The kid glared at Naruto and continued on his rant, "Of course I mean you. Do you see anyone else? Now apologize for tripping me." Naruto got up and walked over to the kid. He then picked the kid up by his shirt and told him flat out, "Kid, you tripped on your scarf." End of story. Before Naruto could put the kid down, a voice came from down the hall screaming, "Honorable grandson." The voice soon gained a body when a man wearing all blue from his neck down, a blue bandana and circular sunglasses burst through the open door and froze the second he saw Naruto. The man thought, "The Kyuubi brat." He then saw that Naruto was still holding the kid by his shirt and shouted, "You unhand him, that is Konohamaru, the honorable grandson of the third Hokage." Naruto simply looked at the Hokage as if to ask, "Seriously?" The Hokage nodded. The newly introduced Konohamaru smirked and said, "That's right, I'm Konohamaru, and you wouldn't dare hurt me, would you?" he asked mockingly. Now that ticked Naruto off as he said calmly, "Kid, I don't care if he's your grandmother." Naruto then knocked Konohamaru on the head, sending him to the floor before walking out. As Konohamaru fell to the ground, he thought, "This guy's different." Then promptly got well acquainted with the floor. The guy standing by the door was gaping like a fish out of water at what Naruto had done, but paid him no mind as he walked out. His primary concern was Konohamaru. So he screamed, "Honorable grandson," and rushed to help Konohamaru up. Konohamaru stared at the door and asked, "Who was that?" His grandfather said, "That my boy was Naruto Uzumaki." Konohamaru looked at his grandfather and saw the proud expression on his face, all the while ignoring whatever the guy in blue was spouting. When the guy turned away tooting his own horn, Konohamaru left the room. The guy in blue was just finishing a minute later as he said, "And that is why I am your quickest way to becoming Hokage. Do you understand, honorable grandson?" He looked at where Konohamaru was sitting only to find him gone. Then he freaked out again and asked in a loud shout, "Where did he go?" Hiruzen chuckled and said, Konohamaru-kun left a minute ago, probably to find Naruto." The guy panicked and ran out the door screaming, "I'm coming to save you, honorable grandson." Streets of Konoha. Naruto was just walking down the street minding his own business, while discussing his training with Kurama, who was taking an active role in figuring out how things could work so Naruto could test them. His ideas usually ended up with Naruto in a lot of pain, but very few of them worked. The other ideas Naruto filed away as crimes against humanity. So if you vibrate your fist 50 times a second, you can then create a ball of sound that will act as a power boost, and eventually you can vibrate it faster and make it stronger. Finished Kurama with a smirk. Naruto had a terrified expression as he thought, "Kurama, that's a good idea, but first I have to find a way to freely manipulate sound." Kurama grumbled at Naruto's thought and said, "Naruto, you said sound works in waves, right?" Naruto nodded his confirmation. "Then why not start with wind? You also said it works in waves." Naruto stopped walking and had the overwhelming feeling of wanting to face palmed. Why hadn't he thought of that? Naruto then decided to confront something that had been bothering him since he left the Hokage's office. Naruto turned around and stared at a box that had eye holes before saying, "Stop following me, brat," while picking up the very bad disguise revealing Konohamaru. Konohamaru jumped up and shouted, "Wow, you saw through my disguise." He said this with awe in his voice. Naruto quirked an eyebrow and thought, that was supposed to be a disguise? Konohamaru broke his train of thought screaming, "That it?" He then turned to Naruto and said, "Okay, you're my new boss." Naruto faltered right then and there before mumbling, "Boss?" Konohamaru nodded excitedly and said, "That's right, you're the boss," he finished with a grin. Naruto knew this would only bring him trouble but asked, "And what does a boss do exactly?" Konohamaru just kept grinning as he explained, "Well, you train me so I can become Hokage, so to start, can you teach me the justice you used to beat Grandpa?" Naruto sighed as he tried to think of a way out of this, but then he had a thought and a wicked grin threatened to split his face. He looked at Konohamaru and asked, "You really want to learn from me?" Konohamaru's response was to nod his head really fast. Naruto said, "Let's get training." Time skip. Forest clearing. Naruto smiled as he sat and looked at an exhausted Konohamaru. Konohamaru, who was breathing heavily, asked, "So how did I do, boss?" Naruto gave a fox-like grin as he said, "Better than expected." Konohamaru smiled at the compliment and boasted, "Yah, at this rate I'll Hokage in no time." Naruto laughed at Konohamaru's excitement but then asked, "Why do you want to be Hokage so badly anyway?" Guy in blue. "Where is that brat?" he growled as he continued his search for Naruto and Konohamaru. As he searched, he eventually found himself the forest, having run out of places to search in the village. Soon after entering the forest, he caught sight of something orange. He immediately rushed towards it. Forest clearing. He arrived just in time to great Naruto ask why Konohamaru wants to be Hokage so badly. He wanted to go down there but stopped as Konohamaru began to speak. Konohamaru looked down with a sad expression and said, "My grandfather named me Konohamaru after the ancient name of village, so it should be easy to remember, but no one calls me that name, not a single person. All they see is the honorable grandson of the third Hokage. No one knows who I am. I can't stand that anymore, it's like I'm invisible. I hate that, that's the reason I've got to become a Hokage soon so people will know who I am." Naruto sat there listening to what Konohamaru had said and replied, "Sorry to say it doesn't work that way." Konohamaru turned and looked at Naruto as he continued, "A kid like you can't just turn into a Hokage after a couple of days, it's just impossible." Konohamaru got defensive and hopped up balling his fists and yelled, "What?" Naruto remained in his spot and said while looking Konohamaru dead in the eyes, "It's not that simple." Konohamaru shouted, "Why isn't it?" Naruto smirked and turned towards Konohamaru and finished, "Because you got competition for that spot." Konohamaru asked, "Who?" As Naruto stood up he finished, "The person you have to beat is me." Before Konohamaru could respond a voice sounded, "I found you." Out of the trees a man jumped down right next to Naruto and Konohamaru. Konohamaru looked at who it was and deadpanned, "Oh, it's just you, Ebisu-sensei." The newly named Ebisu faceplanted at Konohamaru's disinterest in his arrival but quickly regained his composure before grabbing Konohamaru's arm and processing to drag him away. Konohamaru struggled against Ebisu's grip as the man said, "Come now, honorable grandson, you must not associate yourself with rifftraff like him," giving Naruto a weary glare. Konohamaru managed to work his arm free and then screamed, "No. I won't go with you." In fact, he gave a devious grin, formed a seal and shouted, "Oiroke no jutsu." A poof of smoke later and in Konohamaru's place was a long brown-haired female whom was very much nude, and her only saving grace was that the leftover smoke covered her more sensual areas. Ebisu was shocked at the audacity of this technique, but that didn't stop his nose from bleeding. But sadly it didn't have the full effect that Konohamaru wanted because Ebisu was able to stem the bleeding and prevent himself from passing out if just barely. Ebisu shouted, What kind of scandalous technique is that? Such tasteless vulgarity can never influence me, I am far above it." At this point Ebisu grabbed Konohamaru's scarf and tried to drag him away, but Konohamaru put up all the resistance he could muster. Naruto didn't take Ebisu's criticism of his own creation very well and exclaimed, "Kage Bushin no Justu?" Naruto drew their attention by creating around 20 to 30 clones. While Konohamaru was in awe, Ebisu looked unimpressed and even admitted it by saying, "I'm unimpressed as a jonin, I am an elite, not some lightweight like Mizuki." With each word Ebisu began to walk until he was in the dead center of the crowd of clones. "Bring it," taunted Ebisu with a smirk. Naruto and all his clones responded by shouting, "Henge." All of the clones and Naruto were shrouded in smoke only to reappear as a group of rather large-eyed and very much nude pigtailed blondes to show up and glomp Ebisu while saying in very voices, "Oh Ebisu-sama." Ebisu couldn't take it now, he was launched back with a massive nosebleed and fainted before he hit the ground. "Gotcha with my harem no justu," exclaimed Naruto with a large smirk. Naruto then turned to Konohamaru and said, "Now Konohamaru, let's go get some ramen," he finished with a smile. Konohamaru beamed and said, "Okay boss." Episode 3-5, Team Formation and Evaluation. Naruto hummed a happy tune as he walked towards the academy for the last time in his actual clothes minus the mask. He was saving that for a surprise. Today was the day he finally got his teammates and Jonin sensei, and he couldn't be more excited. Over the last week since he met Konohamaru, Naruto had gone back to training with Hinata while he had a clone teach Konohamaru whenever he showed up. Hinata had gained a fair bit of confidence over the last 2 weeks. While it didn't stop her stuttering, it did tone it down to where it only happened every now and then. Naruto was also getting better with Fuinjutsu. So far he was able to make a storage scroll, but that was still iffy because, to be honest, his handwriting sucked donkey balls. His scroll worked for about 5 minutes before it vaporized, and his kunai he sealed and it vanished. Needless to say, he wouldn't be sealing anything valuable anytime soon. But that being said, he did improve on examining seals. He could identify more than 50 different kinds of them, though they were all still low-level seals. Naruto also got started on trying to train his elemental affinity, which he found he had thanks to Kurama. Flashback. Kurama had Naruto find some chakra paper because while he could read his affinity, he wasn't able to read how strong it was. So after Naruto had liberated a couple of slips from an unsuspecting Chunin who was minding his own business, Naruto immediately ran for the Hyuga compound. When he had arrived, he found Hinata training under the watchful eye of her father. Naruto, being himself, yelled, "Hinata-chan." The pair of Hyugas turned just as Naruto skid to a stop in front of them. Hiyashi was the first to speak by saying with the slightest smile, "Ah, Uzumaki-san, we were wondering when you would arrive." Naruto gave a quick nod before saying with a grin, "Hi Hiyashi-sama, sorry for being late, but I wanted to pick something up." Hiroshi raised an eyebrow, but Giants asked, "Anyo, what did you pick up, Naruto-kun?" Naruto smiled and reached into his pocket and pulled out a couple of pieces of paper. Hinata looked confused, but Hiyashi was surprised by the slips of paper, knowing exactly what they were. Hiyashi said, "Well, Uzumaki-san, I must say that I didn't expect you to have affinity paper." Naruto rubbed the back of his head sheepishly and said, "Well, you know me, full of surprises." Hinata and Hiyashi both thought, "Don't we know it?" Naruto then turned to Hinata and said, "So what do you say, Hinata-chan, do you want to test your affinity?" As he said this, he held out a piece of paper. Hinata nodded and grabs a slip of the paper. Hiyashi smiles and says, "Well, if you are going to do this, then I shall tell you what your results mean." The two children smiled and nodded. Then Naruto said, "Ladies first." He smiled at Hinata, who blushed and nodded. Hinata charged her paper with chakra, and they were all surprised at what happened. Her paper became so wet that it fell apart in her hand and fell to the ground in puddle, but it did not stop there because the puddle began to evaporate almost instantly. Hiyashi was shocked at Hinata's results and thought, "I understand water from her mother, but where did fire come from, and how are they so powerful, and on top of that they're polar opposites, it shouldn't be possible." Naruto and Hinata looked at Hiyashi, both surprised by his expression of shock, but Hiyashi soon snapped out of it and said, "Well, Hinata, I must say that I am surprised." Hinata looked down, scared that she had upset her father, but he quickly stopped this by laying his hands on her shoulders and kneeling down to look her in the eyes and said, "Hinata, know now that I am proud of you and always will be." Hinata's eyes began to water as she looked up and smiled at her father before jumping at him and hugging him. Hiyashi smiled and hugged her back. Naruto stood to the side, happy for his friend but slightly jealous. He stepped away and waited until they separated a few minutes later. When they had stopped hugging, Hinata had a smile that was absolutely beaming. Hiyashi stood up all the way and said to Naruto, "Okay, Naruto-san, it's time for you to find your affinity, then I will tell you both your results." Naruto nodded and charged his card, only for it to begin to glow bright blue with some reddish orange showing every now and then. Hiyashi was honestly so surprised it was amazing. He hadn't fainted, but he still had an idea of what it meant, so he said, "Okay, now both of you have surprised me a lot with your results." First he turned to his daughter and said, "Hinata, your paper indicated that you have 2 affinities, one for water and one for fire, and both are quite strong." Hinata and Naruto's eyes widened at this. Then Hiyashi dropped another bomb and turned to Naruto and said, "Naruto-san, I can honestly say that if I am right, you definitely deserve your title as the most unpredictable person alive." Naruto blinked confused as Hiyashi continued, "Your paper glowed blue now. This is normally what happens when someone whose affinity hasn't been determined yet tries to test it." Naruto looked down thinking that he would have to wait longer to see his affinity, but Hiyashi kept going. However, your paper glowed bright blue, so bright it was almost blinding. Normally it's a dim blue. Now I believe this means that you have an affinity for pure chakra. Naruto was shocked at this proclamation but heard Kurama say, "Good, it worked." Naruto, still shocked, asked, "What worked and where have you been the last few days?" Kurama responded with a cheeky grin. "Remember how I explained that each Jinchuriki gains a trait from the Biju?" Naruto mentally nodded and thought, "Yeah, but what does that have to do with anything?" Kurama said with the grin never leaving his face, "What I mean is that I gave you my ability to manipulate pure chakra to the point it's your natural affinity, but I couldn't be sure it would work the way I wanted it to until your affinity was tested." Naruto nodded and asked, "Why does this mean exactly?" Kurama responded, "It means that you could use pure chakra just like elemental and create just you, everything from senbon of chakra to a freaking chakra dragon, and even making extra appendages if you want. Granted, that would take time and practice. Also, every elemental affinity will require the same amount of time to master, so you can possibly master all of them. And on top of that, you can use chakra much like how Shukaku uses sand. Just imagine what you want and you can make it. Granted, you still need practice to use it to a large scale." Naruto gained a distant look that worried Hiyashi and Hinata. After a few minutes, Naruto's face gained a shit-eating grin and screamed, "Yada!" scaring the crap out of the Hyugas. End flashback. Naruto and Hinata had both began to train their affinities. Hinata had decided to start on water so she could incorporate it into her taijutsu, while Naruto did both his wind and pure chakra affinities with the liberal use of about 40 shadow clones. Naruto had began to slowly increase the number of clones he would use in training so as to condition himself for the mental strain it created. Kurama had told Naruto that controlling pure chakra was all about will and putting the power behind it to make the chakra visible. So the clones that did this were mostly just playing around with chakra, trying to make up whatever came to mind. So by the end of his training weeks he had a few new pure chakra, just making him giddy to try them out on a real opponent. As far as his wind affinity went, Hiyashi showed him the leaf-cutting exercise he saw his friend do when he trained it. When Naruto asked about this friend, Hiyashi smiled sadly and said that he had died a while back, but he was now able to cut a leaf about halfway. Now one would ask how Naruto got so good in this time. It was because when he started having trouble, Hiyashi told Naruto to imagine his chakra cutting. This got Naruto off to a great start. During this week, Naruto was very productive in training his current ability. He had gotten to the point that Hinata could barely hit him, and that was when she was actually trying. Other than that, he had began to try and start on another of his 6 powers. He decided to stick with the name the warrior had of Tekai, Iron Mass. By using his pure chakra, he would harden the point of impact for any hit. Right now he was pretty slow about it and could only stop 1 out of every 4 hits from Hinata, but was getting better, and eventually he hoped to be able to cover his entire body. Academy. Naruto walked up into the hall his class was in and grinned an evil grin. He put on his mask and said, "Odaton." Voice amplification. First of all, Naruto still does not have any control over sound, but all this just does is increase his voice's loudness and adjust it. All of Naruto's classmates were sitting in their seats doing whatever they wanted as they waited for their sensei. When they heard something, it sounded like footsteps from heavy boots. Then it began. Hinata sighed and thought, "Really? Killing time Trigun. Total slaughter." As he sang, Naruto began to release small amounts of killer intent so as to make people nervous as he walked towards the room. Total slaughter. Some of the students began to hid under their desks while the clan rookies, even Shikamaru, sat staring at the door except for Sakura and Ino, who were hiding behind Sasuke as if he would protect them. "I won't leave a single man alive." This caught Sasuke's attention because it sounded like what that man had done. La dee da dee die. This tune disturbed most of them. Genocide caught Sasuke's attention, and that fact he was actually scared now. La dee da dee died. The voice took a slightly more demonic tone as the door flew open, but no one could see who it was. An ocean of blood. Everyone gazed into the hall only to see it was pitch black, but the second the word blood was spoken, a pair of blood-red slit eyes appeared in the hall along with a massive grin that showed long canine teeth ready to bite. "Let's begin the killing time." The being began to walk in, showing everybody his mask first as he formed from the inky darkness, followed by his pure white clothing and boots. But what caught their attention was the tribal Kyuubi on his shirt and his terrifying mask. He then turned to them all and said, "Time to die." nonchalantly before laughing maniacally. Everyone, namely the civilian children, jumped up and began to scramble for the door except for the clan children and Sakura, who was still hiding behind Sasuke with Ino. Hinata got up and began to walk towards the figure, gaining wide eyes from everyone who wasn't still scratching at the door. The figure just stood there and allowed her to walk up to him. When she got right in front of him, he asked, "And what do you have to say?" She put a hand on his cheek just under his mask and said, "Cute." Everyone face faulted, but when they regained their composure they saw the figure in a corner with a cloud of depression overhead mumbling, "Not cute, I'm badass." Everyone's sweat dropped. This was the scene Iruka walked into. He sighed and walked to his desk before saying, "Everyone get away from the door and take your seat, that means you to Mr. Moping Maelstrom." Everyone thought, Moping Maelstrom? Then it hit them all at once, Naruto. Naruto grinned behind his mask before walking up to sit next to Hinata, laughing all the way. Iruka chuckled because he saw everything that had happened along with everyone else in the Hokage's office, who were all laughing their asses off right now. Iruka said, "All right, now on to team assignments. Team 1. Skipping unimportant teams. Team 7 Naruto Uzumaki, Sasuke Uchiha, and Sakura Haruno." Naruto had a smile. Sasuke looked indifferent but also interested, and Sakura looked plain scared at first, but that turned back to fangirl quick enough. Team 8 Kiba Inuzuka, Hinata Hyuga, and Shino Aburame. Naruto shot Hinata a happy grin, knowing both Kiba and Shino would protect her if need be. But he also knew that chances were she would be the one doing the protecting. Finally, Team 10 Shikamaru Nara, Choji Akamachi, and Ino Yamanaka. Shika mumbled, "Troublesome." Choji continued to munch on his snacks, and Ino looked like her world had crumbled. Iruka looked up from his clipboard and said, "Congratulations everyone, I wish you the best, and your new senseis will be here momentarily." With that he exited the room. Naruto kicked back and decided to wait it all the while going over what his clones had been doing for the last few hours. The unimportant teams were picked up quickly enough. Soon after, a very beautiful woman wearing a white dress walked through the door along with a man dressed in normal Jonin attire. The woman said, "Team 8 with me," while the man simply said, "Team 10, and made a come on sign with his hand. Both teams left, but as Hinata passed he said with a smile, "Good luck, Hinata-chan." Hinata said, "You to Naruto-kun." With that she left with her team. 2.5 hours later. Naruto's eye had been twitching for the last hour, so he decided to give his sensei a proper welcome. So he got up from his chair and walked towards the door. Sasuke saw this and demanded, "Dobi, what are you doing?" Naruto simply said, "If he wants to be late, then I am going to give him a reason." With that he walked out of the door and returned a few minutes later with a bucket of water, which he then placed on the door's frame. He then went back to his seat with an satisfied grin. Sakura said, "Naruto Baka, there is no way that a Jonin would fall for such a simple trick." Naruto ignored her and just stared at the door. A few more minutes later the door opened and the bucket of water fell, but the man caught it before it could get him wet. He wore the standard Jonin outfit, but he had a mask covering the bottom half of his face and gravity-defying silver hair. He turned towards Naruto and asked, "My name is Kakashi and I will be your sensei." "Now did you seriously expect that to work?" Naruto grinned and pulled out a kunai and held it up to cut the thin wire besides him that no one noticed till now. He then said, "No." He then cut the wire. Kakashi was caught off guard as he was dragged by his ankles by ropes, making him drop the bucket and soak himself. The ropes pulled him out of a window and into a ready-made catapult. Before he could get up he saw a Naruto clone who simply waved goodbye and pulled the lever that sent him flying. Back in the classroom, Sasuke and Sakura were staring at Naruto in unveiled shock. When Sasuke snapped out of it he asked, "What did you just do to him?" Naruto grinned a psychopathic grin and replied, "Let's just say he will never see dogs the same again." A few miles away, Kakashi finally landed unceremoniously on his face in the middle of the street. He groaned as a crowd gathered to see if he was okay, but he ignored all of them in favor of the piece of paper that was laying right in front of him. It said, "Dear Sensei, I hope this teaches you never to be late again, because if you are, what's about to happen will only be the tip of the iceberg. Now there is a tape underneath this paper. Give it to the man in the shop next to you and ask him to play it." Kakashi did as asked and the man agreed and went to play it, but as he left Kakashi kept reading. Now in the bucket that you were soaked with was enough an entire self of the Inuzuka's female pheromone to attract every male all over the village, and it will last for the next couple of hours or so. So I have one question. Do you know who let the dogs out? Good luck, Naruto. Kakashi's eyes widened as he heard howling and a scream of, "WHO let the dogs out." Come from the Inuzuka pens and a lot of baking. Then the music from the tape started. Who Let the Dogs Out by Baha Men. I will leave your imagination to decide what happened. Back in the academy an hour later. The grin never left his face as Naruto looked out the window of the room listening to the screams of terror that his prank had caused. Sasuke and Sakura moved to a far corner of the room away from Naruto because minutes after his prank had been sprung he started to laugh manically. They all listened as the scream of a little girl got closer and closer before the door to their classroom flew open and Kakashi ran in slamming the door behind him, but two dogs tried to push the door back open. Kakashi screamed, "Get back Cruffy! Get back Scruffy! Get back you flea-infested mongrel!" With one last push he closed the door, then made a couple of hand signs and said, "Doden. Earth wall." A wall of earth formed in front of the door, strengthening it. Kakashi turned towards Naruto and glared at the laughing boy, saying, "Not funny." Even Sasuke and Sakura thought it was funny but restrained themselves from laughing. Kakashi sighed and calmed down and said, "Now normally I would say meet me on the roof, but..." Barking could still be heard on the other side of the door. "Yeah, so we'll do introductions here." Sakura proposed, "Sensei, why don't you go first so we can see the way you want us to do it?" Kakashi nodded and said, "Very well. My name is Kakashi Hitaki, my likes are none of your business, neither are my dislikes, my hobbies. Well, you're too young to know that. Dreams never thought of them." The three genin all had sweat drops and thought, all he told us was his name. Kakashi eyes smiled and said, "Okay, now you." He pointed at Sakura. Sakura nodded and said, "My name is Sakura Haruno, my likes are the person I like is, my hobbies include." Looks at Sasuke, "Eep. My dreams are." She blushed a deep red. Kakashi shook his head but said, "Okay, next you." He pointed to Sasuke. Sasuke said, "Name Sasuke Uchiha. Likes none. Hobbies none. Dislikes a lot of things. Dreams no, I have an ambition, it's to kill a certain man." Sakura thought with a blush, "Cool." Naruto rolled his eyes and thought, "Oh, give me a break." Kakashi sighed and thought, "Yup, he's an Avenger, gonna have to break him of that." Kakashi then turned to Naruto and said, "Your turn, Mr. Mask." Naruto smiled and said, "My name is Naruto Uzumaki, my likes include ramen, Hinata-chan and her family, the Hokage, music, my flute, and a certain fox. My hobbies are pranking and playing music. My dislikes include the time it takes to cook ramen, not listening or playing music, people who can't see the difference between a kunai and the scroll it's sealed in. And I hate a certain Uchiha and have made it part of my dream to kill him." He said this last part with a sneer of anger. The others were surprised by the fact Naruto hated anything, let alone an Uchiha. Sakura made her thoughts known by screaming, "Naruto baka, just because you can't measure up to Sasuke-kun doesn't mean you have to hate him, and you wouldn't even be able to kill him if you tried." Naruto gave her a leveled glare and sneered, "Shut up Haruno, get it through your thick head, we are ninja now, so you better start acting like it," he said, shocking the others, even Sasuke, but he continued, "I wasn't even talking about your precious Uchiha." He said this last bit sarcastically before continuing, "No, the one I am talking about is much more dangerous." Sasuke cut him off saying, "No, you won't take him because I will be the one to kill him." Naruto scoffed at Sasuke and said, "You think I mean Itachi? Ha, the one I'm going after is much more dangerous." Sasuke stood confused and said, "What do you mean? Last I checked, me and Itachi were the only Uchiha left." Naruto snorted, "Grow up and learn that you can't do every alone. Also, I have it on good authority that an Uchiha was the one that killed my parents on the day I was born and that he is still around." The others were shocked beyond belief, but Sasuke still managed to ask, "Whose authority is that?" Naruto turned from him and said, "None of your business." With that he turned and left by jumping out an open window. The three remaining ninja just stared at the window for a few more minutes before Kakashi snapped out of it and said, "Okay, now that that is done, here be at this location at this time tomorrow. I will explain then, since I need to go and give Naruto the information now." Sasuke and Sakura nodded as Kakashi left out of the same window. It didn't take long before they heard him scream, "Oh come on," followed by a lot of barking. Top of the Hokage monument an hour later. Naruto sighed as he sat on top of his father's head berating himself, thinking, fuck, why did I blow up like that? Even if it was true. Kurama didn't like to see Naruto like this, so he said, Naruto, calm down, none of that was your fault. Naruto wanted to agree with Kurama but couldn't seem to allow himself to, but thought, it may not have been Kurama, but that doesn't make me feel any better. As he said this, he brought his knees up to his chest and stared at his mask, which was in his hands. Kid, I honestly don't know what to say that will make you feel better, so I'm just going to say get over it. Kurama finished. Get over it? Naruto repeated. Yup, get over it and get on with your life. Also don't live for revenge or else you'll only end up like Sasuke if he continues down his path, finished Kurama with a grin, knowing what that last tidbit would do. Naruto paled slightly and shouted, oh hell no. I will never end up like that emo prick. Naruto heard chuckling from behind him, so he turned around and found Kakashi eyes smiling at him. Kakashi said, well, I hope not, it would be too much of a pain to have two moping students around all the time. Naruto stood up and walked up to Kakashi, bowed his head down and said in a low voice, I'm sorry. Kakashi bent down and used his hand to lift Naruto's head before saying, there is nothing to be sorry for, Naruto. With that he hugged Naruto. Naruto didn't know what to do in this situation, but then he heard Kurama say, do what your heart tells you to. Kurama's words were what broke the dam. Naruto's eyes overflowed with tears as he returned Kakashi's hug with a cry of, Inu-ni-san. Kakashi was surprised at what Naruto called him but decided to ask later. Eventually Naruto managed to calm down and say, thank you Inu-ni for being there when I was younger, for protecting me. Kakashi eyes smiled and said, you're welcome Oto, but I had to ask, how did you know? Naruto managed to give him a smile and said, kind of hard not to when you're the only person in the village with gravity-defying silver hair. Kakashi had to restrain himself from face-palming at that but did say, I guess so, huh? Naruto's smile grew to a grin by this point and Kakashi continued, okay Oto, now tomorrow meet at Training Ground 7 at 7 AM, okay? Naruto nodded happily and Kakashi said, good, now go home and get some sleep, trust me you have a long day tomorrow. Naruto nodded again and with one more hug he began to run home, but as he ran he screamed, thank you Inu-ni-san, and remember, if you're late tomorrow I will make what I did today look like a whoopee cushion by comparison. Kakashi paled at the mere thought of what Naruto would do but turned to walk home until he heard barking and screamed, oh come on, and ran for his life. With Naruto had returned to his apartment and decided to go to sleep a little early. As he settled in bed he heard Kurama say, well, looks like you got someone else to add to your growing list of precious people. Naruto smiled and mumbled, thank you Kurama. Kurama asked, for what? Naruto continued, for being my first friend. Having said this he fell asleep. Kurama gave a truly happy smile and said, no Naruto, thank you for being mine. With that he fell asleep. Next morning, Training Ground 7. It was about 6:30 a.m. when Naruto walked into Training Ground 7. He looked around to get a layout of the land and saw there was a bridged, large forest on both sides of the grounds, a decent-sized lake, and a good-sized plain area with 3 poles sticking out of the ground. But what caught his eye was the memorial stone that was off to the side of the bridge just outside of the training grounds. Naruto walked up to the stone and looked at the various names labeled on it, but 2 names stood out. They were his parents Minato Namikaze and Kushina Uzumaki. Naruto vowed that he would live up to them and make them proud. Kurama told Naruto, you already have Naruto. Naruto smiled as he walked to the poles and thought, thank you Kurama. When Naruto reached the poles he was surprised to find that Sasuke was leaning against the pole on the far left and Sakura was sitting on top of the pole in the middle. They both watched as Naruto walked up to them. When he was right in front of them he said, sorry for the way I acted yesterday. Sakura was the first to speak. It's okay Naruto, from what you said yesterday you had every right to be angry. I know I would be angry if someone did the same to my family. Naruto gave a small nod and smile from behind his mask and said, thanks Sakura. Sakura smiled and said, no problem Naruto. She then held out her hand and asked, friends? Naruto beamed and grabbed her hand and said, friends. Naruto turned towards Sasuke and asked, well? Sasuke looked at Naruto and said, Look, after what you said yesterday I went home and thought about what you said, and I realized that as much as I would love to destroy him with my own hands right now, it's going to take time to get strong enough to do that, and even then chances are either way one of us would kill the other, so it might help if someone helped me. Sasuke said, all of this getting wide eyes from both Naruto and Sakura. Naruto snapped out of his shock, first turned to Sakura and said, "Damn, I think that's the most I've ever heard you say at once." Sasuke's eye twitched, causing Naruto to chuckle and say, "Oh, calm down, I get where you're coming from, I think, so how about this, we help you take down Itachi and you help me take down my target, deal?" Sasuke smirked, "Deal." Sakura pitched in, "Don't forget about me." They stared at her and Naruto asked, "Are you sure?" Sakura said, "Yup, can't let you two go and get yourselves killed now, can I?" Naruto and Sasuke both smirked at her answer. "Oh good, you're all getting along," said Kakashi as he walked into the clearing at 7 o'clock exactly. "Hey sensei," shouted Naruto happily. Sasuke nodded in his direction, and Sakura waved at him. Kakashi's eyes smiled, having seen everything that had happened in the last few minutes and already could tell these three would most likely pass, but he still had to test them. Kakashi motioned for them to come closer. When they did, he pulled out 2 bells and said, "Now normally I would take a while to explain everything, I don't feel that's necessary, so I'll give you the quick rundown, okay?" The 3 of them nodded as Kakashi continued, "Good. Alright then, you have until noon to get these 2 bells from me. This test has a 66% failing rate. Whoever does not retrieve one of these bells will fail and be sent back to the academy for another year, understood?" As Kakashi spoke, Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura's faces paled and gained expressions of pure horror. Kakashi smiled and said, "Okay, remember, come at me with the intent to kill and begin." Instantly Sasuke and Sakura disappeared, trying to get some distance to make a plan. Kakashi looked at Naruto and said, "You're a strange one, aren't you?" Naruto shrugged and said, "Well, one way to find out, right?" With that he settled into his fighting stance that he used against Mizuki. Legs slightly bent and shoulder-width apart with his arms hanging at his sides. Kakashi gave a chuckle and said, "True." Naruto smirked and said, "Well, come at me." Kakashi nodded and charged at Naruto with low chunin speed. Naruto could tell he was holding back a lot because he was only moving slightly faster than Mizuki did. Kakashi sent a wide swipe with his arm, so Naruto jumped back to avoid it but was unable to avoid Kakashi, who stepped on the gas, suddenly going at high chunin speed, aiming a punch for his sternum. Naruto didn't have any choices, being that he was still in mid-air, so in order to avoid a lot of damage he called Tekai. Kakashi's punch landed, knocking some of the air out of Naruto and sent him further into the air and farther back than he intended, but Naruto managed to somersault in the air and stick the landing, quickly regaining his balance and falling back into his stance. Kakashi's eyes widened from the moment his punch landed. The second his fist hit Naruto's chest, it felt like he hit a boulder, but his surprise increased as he saw Naruto land and get back into his stance, looking only slightly winded. So he asked, "How?" Naruto grinned, having regained the small amount of breath he had lost, and said, "Easy, that was my Tekai ability. By charging chakra to the point of impact, I'm able to significantly decrease the amount of damage I sustain while causing some damage to my opponent in return, but it's far from finished, cause that punch is still gonna leave a good-sized bruise." Kakashi nodded, generally intrigued by this information, but he wasn't the only one, as both Sasuke and Sakura watched. They were shocked by Naruto's ability and decided to hang low for now and wait to see what else he had. Naruto, on the other hand, was having a conversation with Kurama. "So what do you think?" Kurama replied by saying, "Kakashi is definitely holding a lot back, but that is unimportant at the moment. Right now you have to figure this test out." Naruto asked, "Can't you just tell me?" Kurama chuckled and said, "Now where would the fun be in that, but I guess I can give you a hint. So why are you placed in groups of 3 genin?" Naruto thought for a moment, since it looked like Kakashi wasn't going to attack. "Well, according to Iruka-sensei, we are put in squads of 3 genin to increase the chance of mission success and to promote Team WO. Of course, thanked Kurama. Kurama smiled and said, "You're welcome, Naruto, now get to it." Kakashi watched as a melody of emotions played out on Naruto's face. First was confusion, then he displayed a thoughtful look, and finally he showed realization, as if he figured something out. Kakashi thought, I wonder if he figured it out? He got his answer when Naruto reached into a pocket on the inner lining of his coat and pulled out Tengoku no Kitsune and said with a smirk, "Well, it's been fun, sensei, but I got to get to work." Kakashi went on guard. After all, he had been there when Naruto fought Mizuki, so he knew exactly what he was capable of with that instrument. Sasuke and Sakura both stared at their blonde teammate and wondered what he would do with a glass flute of all things. They got their answer when he shouted, "Shadow clone, just you," and then began to play a calm tune for a moment as the clones made hand signs calling chakra manipulation. Fox claws, pure blue chakra, formed 5 armor-like claws over each of the clones' hands. Kakashi was in a word speechless. Chakra manipulation? What the fuck? But he was cut short of his musing as the clones began to charge him as the real Naruto called Mirage Assault. Kakashi wasn't worried about the clones per se, but it's what happened during the first assault from them that surprised him. During this assault, the first clone jumped and aimed for Kakashi's head, so Kakashi ducked under, allowing the clone to sail over him. Then the next 2 came not even a moment later. Working together, they tried to clothesline him, but Kakashi dodged by jumping over and out of reach. This is where the final clone came and tried to impale Kakashi. But Kakashi outmaneuvered the clone by grabbing its arm while still in the air and flipping over it before kicking the clone. His shock came from the fact that the clone didn't disappear in a poof of smoke like normal. No, his foot went through the clone, who just blurred out of existence. Kakashi landed and turned to see the first 3 clones standing there looking at him, and a moment later the clone he had just kicked blurred back into existence next to them. Kakashi had to give it to Naruto, he truly was unpredictable. Naruto. During the first confrontation, the real Naruto was able to slip away from Kakashi and into the forest in order to find his teammates. Finding Sakura was easy enough considering she was running around the forest making so much noise it was impossible not to notice her. When he explained everything he found out, omitting some things like Kurama, she agreed and said that they needed to find Sasuke to let him know. Sasuke was a little harder to find, but when they did, they showed up just in time to see Kakashi fighting the last 2 clone of Naruto that were standing. Naruto smirked and asked, "Enjoying the show?" Sasuke turned to him and said, "While I do want an explanation, it can wait." Naruto nodded and said, "Alright, I promise to explain later, but for now we need a plan. Does anyone have one?" Sakura was the first to speak and say, "I have one." Kakashi had to say Naruto's tactic was impressive. This combo of clones and genjutsu would defeat many ninja. But Kakashi wasn't one of them. After having gotten annoyed with this pointless back and forth, Kakashi had grabbed one of the clones when it attacked him and without letting go punched it in the face, only to be rewarded with a poof of smoke signifying its defeat. The gears turned quite fast in Kakashi's mind as he figured out how Naruto did it. He used the genjutsu to make the target, in this case Kakashi, see the clone's movements in slow motion after it attacked. So when the clone attacked, the genjutsu was not in effect, so the clone moved normally, but after the clone attacked, the genjutsu activated, forcing the target to see the clone move in slow motion but perceive it as normal. It was like showing someone a video in slow motion but convincing them it was running at normal speed. So while the target saw the clone right next to them, in reality the clone was already out of danger and at a safe distance. With this knowledge, it didn't take Kakashi that long to dispatch the remaining clones. As he finished the final clone, he turned to see Naruto, who was already playing a fast but pleasant tune on his flute. But Kakashi became wary when the flute began to glow, but surprised when a chakra version of a musical stanza began to flow out of one end of the flute until it was around 20 feet long and 3 feet wide. Naruto smirked and shouted, "Good luck, sensei, stanza strike." With the flick of his hand, Naruto used his flute to guide the stanza like a whip at Kakashi. Kakashi was confused. How did Naruto expect to hit him from there? He was 40 feet away from Naruto and that jutsu's range was too short. He got his answer when he saw the stanza begin to lengthen as it narrowed, forcing him to jump away. Naruto smirked and shouted, "I see you understand now, sensei. I can control the length of this just you by making it wider or thinner, thus shortening or lengthening it." Kakashi's eye began to twitch as he thought, "The hell, this kid is pulling more just you out of his ass than I have copied." Kakashi continued to dodge, unaware that Naruto was forcing him towards stage 2 of their plan. When Kakashi was forced near the lake, he heard a splash and turned around to see Sakura already throwing multiple kunai at him before diving back into the water. Kakashi dodged the kunai but heard a sizzling sound and ran, as the kunais Sakura had just thrown were equipped with explosive tags on them. They exploded, making a decent-sized blast. Kakashi skid to a stop as he escaped the blast with only a few burns on his cloths. However, just as he stopped, Sasuke jumped from the bushes, made some hand signs, and shouted Kaden, Grand Fireball. Kakashi stood shocked and thought, a genin shouldn't have the chakra needed to perform that technique. Sasuke formed a massive orb of fire from his mouth towards Kakashi, quickly proving him wrong and forcing him back towards Naruto. Naruto saw his chance and using the still-formed stanza sent it at the airborne Kakashi and had it wrap around him like a rope, making sure to keep his hands apart and ending the battle. End fight. Naruto reeled in Kakashi as both Sasuke and Sakura walked up to Naruto. Sakura took this opportunity to get the bells by cutting them from Kakashi's belt with a kunai. Naruto then released Kakashi only after the bells were in their hands. It was at this point that the alarm went off. Kakashi's eyes smiled as he was set on the ground and released from his binds. When he was completely free, he said, "Good job you three, I am very impressed with what you have done." The three smiled, or in Sasuke's case smirked, and said, "Thank you, sensei." Kakashi then asked, "Now can any of you tell me what the purpose of this test was?" Again they all spoke at the same time and said, "Teamwork." Kakashi nodded and said, "Another point for each of you, now onto evaluations." First he turned to Sakura and said, "Sakura, while I didn't get a very good read on your abilities during this test, I can learn more as we go along, but from what I could see and have read in your file, you are a very technical person, but from what just happened you're not afraid to get up close and personal in a fight, so I would suggest that if you continue this path you either focus on taijutsu or get a weapon, maybe a sword or something like that. Also, you made more noise in that forest than a stampede, so we will be working on your stealth. Finally, you have very small chakra reserves." Sakura blushed as her weak points were pointed out, but Kakashi continued and said, "But you have very good chakra control, so with that you might want to learn some medical just you or something similar." Sakura nodded at Kakashi's assessment of her skills and vowed to get better. Kakashi then turned to Sasuke and said, "Sasuke, you're in a similar boat to Sakura. I didn't get a lot from this test, but you show potential with your fire just you, but showed no taijutsu, so I suggest something that focuses on using your legs, because almost all fire just you are difficult to use without hand signs, so protecting your hands would be useful." Sasuke nodded in approval of his skills. Kakashi finally turned to Naruto and said, "Naruto, I don't know where to begin. You showed great skill in taijutsu, genjutsu, ninjutsu, and tactics. Granted, they can all be refined due to the fact you expelled way too much chakra to do most of your just you. But your stealth is second to none, so I will ask for your help in teaching that to your teammates." Naruto nodded, but Kakashi continued and asked, "There is one thing I have to ask though, what was that fighting style you used and where did you learn those just you?" Naruto smiled and said, "Well, since I already said I would give Sasuke and Sakura an explanation, I guess now's as good a time as any." Naruto cleared his throat and started. "What you saw was my fighting style, the Rokushiki, or 6 powers." Kakashi gained a thoughtful look and said, "I know I have heard that name before, but I can't place where." Naruto smiled and said, "I guess you would have heard about it. All you had to do is look in this book on page 66. As he said this, he pulled the book with the legend out of his trench coat and handed it to Kakashi. Kakashi looked at the book with wide eyes and asked, exasperated, "Naruto, did you seriously do what I think you did?" Naruto grinned and said enthusiastically, "Yup. I took the fighting style of one of these fairy tales and made it real." Sasuke and Sakura were shocked at this explanation from Naruto, and Sasuke asked, "How?" Naruto turned towards them and said, "It was actually easier than I thought. That being said, I only have 2 of the 6 powers made and somewhat functional, but still I got it to work." Kakashi shook his head and said, "I've said it once and I'll say it again, you are the most unpredictable ninja ever." Naruto smirked and said, "I wouldn't be me if I wasn't." They all got a chuckle out of that, even Sasuke, who then asked, "Wait, what about sensei's other question, where did you learn them?" Naruto blinked, having forgot that question. He rubbed the back of his head sheepishly and said, "Oh well, I made them." Kakashi, Sasuke, and Sakura all stared at Naruto for a minute before screaming, "What?" Naruto scratched his cheek and continued, "Yeah, I made them up over the last month or so." Kakashi was close to having a panic attack as he thought, what else can this boy throw at me before I crack? Seriously, some of those just you were close to, if not B rank just you. Sasuke and Sakura both stared at Naruto, who was grinning all the time before he got an idea and said, "Wait, Kakashi-sensei, what did you say that Sasuke and Sakura needed to learn the most?" Kakashi blinked confused and said, "I don't see where this is going, but I'd say Sasuke needs a taijutsu style that focuses primarily on using his legs, and Sakura needs something to allow her to get up close to an enemy and hold her own like a sword style or taijutsu style." "Why do you ask?" Naruto grinned and said, "Pages 37 and 105 inches. Kakashi blinked until he realized he was still holding Naruto's book, so he turned to the pages Naruto pointed out and his eyes grew wide. On the pages were the black leg style and Santoryu style. Kakashi gave Naruto a long hard look before asking, "Are you sure?" Naruto grinned and said, "Well, it's not my choice, is it?" Kakashi chuckled and said, "I guess not." Sasuke frowned at being left out of the loop and asked, "What are you both taking about?" Sakura nodded, confirming her confusion in what was happening. Kakashi looked at them and said, "Well, do you both understand what Naruto just explained?" They both nodded and Sakura said, "I believe so. Naruto found a taijutsu style in some fairy tale and using what the story explained about it recreated it in real life. Am I right?" she asked with a look of confusion. They both nodded and Kakashi said, "Exactly, so can you guess what we are going to do?" Sasuke finished by saying, "My best guess is that both Sakura and myself will also be doing this." Naruto grinned and shouted, "Correctamundo. My duck-ass-haired friend." Kakashi and Sakura both looked at Sasuke's hair for a moment before both burst out in laughter. Sasuke bristled at the insult and growled out rather loudly, "My hair does not look like a duck's ass." Sakura managed to calm herself down quick enough to hand him a compact mirror she had. Sasuke looked at her strangely but opened the tiny mirror and looked in. His face paled and then flushed red in seconds and he screamed, "Why did no one tell me my head looked like poultry?" Another round of laughter exited the other three people in the area. After a few minutes they all managed to calm themselves down. They proceeded to ignore the glare Sasuke was sending them. Kakashi spoke, "Okay, now in order to train you both I must first know, do you want to do the same thing Naruto did?" Both Sasuke and Sakura closed their eyes and thought for a moment. After they thought they looked at each other then at Kakashi and nodded. Naruto grinned and Kakashi's eyes smiled and said, "All right, then so Naruto, would you please explain to them what it is you think they should learn or more accurately create?" Naruto smiled and said, "Hi sensei." Naruto first turned to Sakura and said, "Going of what Kakashi sensei said, I think you should recreate the Santoryu. This style of sword fighting that deals with the wielding of 3 katana, one in each hand and one in the mouth." Sakura questioned, "How would that work?" Naruto shrugged and said, "Beats me, that's for you to figure out." Sakura pouted at Naruto, who then turned to Sasuke and said, "Now the black leg taijutsu style focuses on using the legs and feet, so you can protect your hands." Both nodded as Kakashi decided to intervene in the conversation and suggest, "Well, if you are going to do this then you will all need equipment and tutors." They all blinked and Sakura asked, "Tutors? But you're our sensei." Kakashi smiled and said, "Though I like the sound of that, I'm afraid that I don't know much about fighting with a katana and am not a taijutsu master. Honestly, the one I can help the most is Naruto with his just you, seeing as he throws them around all willy-nilly." Both Sakura and Sasuke looked put out, but Kakashi quickly continued by saying, "Oh, don't get me wrong, I'll still be training you for the majority of the time, but for your styles your tutors will be the ones to handle that." Sasuke and Sakura both smiled at the explanation. Then Naruto asked, "So sensei, what should we do now?" Kakashi brought a finger to his chin and thought, but then said, "For now I want you all to go to an equipment shop and get weights and anything else you might think you would need for training and meet back here in 3 hours. While you're doing this I will be going to report your success to Hokage-sama, understood?" The 3 genin nodded and with that Kakashi shushined away to deliver his report, leaving the 3 of them to their own devices. Sakura then asked, "So does anyone know a good weapons shop?" Sasuke shook his head no, saying that he used the stored-up shuriken and kunai from his clan. Naruto looked thoughtful for a minute before he grinned and said, "I think I know one, but I haven't been there myself." They both looked confused and Sasuke asked, "What do you mean?" Naruto rubbed his head and said, "I was always scared to go in." Sakura blinked confused and asked, "Why?" Naruto sighed and said dejectedly, "Well, I thought they might be like the others." Sasuke and Sakura motioned for him to continue. Naruto continued as he sat down and said, "You might as well sit down, this may take a while." They did as told. "Alright. You both know that I'm not that well liked, right?" They both nodded when they realized why was that. Naruto then continued, "Well, some shops don't like me so much that they either kick me out the second I walk in or overcharge me to a crazy amount. Heck, once an equipment shop owner threw half of his stock of kunai at me just to get me to leave, and what's worse, all I was doing was walking down the street his shop happened to be on." Both Sasuke and Sakura gaped at this, unable to understand why someone would do that to anyone, let alone Naruto. Granted, he pulled a lot of pranks, but none of those were life-threatening, and from what he just said, he was basically attacked just for walking near a store. They both stared for a few more minutes before Sakura asked, "Why would they do that?" Naruto lied by just shrugging and saying, "I don't have a clue, but that's all in the past, so I don't care about that incident." Sasuke and Sakura could only nod dumbly at their teammate's ability to forgive people who wronged him, but Sasuke asked, "How can you forgive them so easily?" Naruto smiled and gained a distant look as he got up from his spot and said, "If I can't forgive those who wrong me, how can I expect others who I wrong to forgive me? Also, if I stoop to their level, one am no better than they are." He then turned and looked at them and smiled, asking, "Right?" Sasuke looked shaken by this as he thought to himself, "Is he right? If I keep going after Itachi, am I no better than he is? But can I forgive him? I'll have to think about this, but for now I'll be a team player." Sasuke promised himself that he would, for the time being, he would try and be friends with both Naruto and Sakura, and with their help take down Itachi and get some answers. Sakura was having a similar problem as she thought, "Sasuke, Naruto, they have both had such hard lives, and here I am complaining out how bad mine is. Compared to them, I'm on fucking cloud 9. Her inner self decided to chip in. "Yeah, we were a total bitch to Naruto and completely worthless to Sasuke. We don't deserve to even be near them." It was then she made a vow to get stronger so she would have the right to even be close to them and strong enough to be able to fight with them. Naruto smiled while thinking, "I hope I got through to them." Kurama decided to speak. "Naruto, just look at them, they're seriously giving it some thought, so for now you have done all you can." Naruto said, gaining Sakura and Sasuke's attention, "Well, let's go get our equipment." Sakura smiled and Sasuke smirked and nodded. With that, they all left for the weapons shop that Naruto knew about. Hokage's office. Knock knock came the tunking of a hand against the Hokage's door. Sarutobi smiled and beckoned them by calling, "Please come in." In walked Kakashi, to whom Sarutobi said, "Ah, Kakashi, I honestly hadn't expected you for another few hours. Shouldn't your test be going on right now?" Kakashi chuckled, embarrassed, and said, "Hi Hokage-sama, normally it would be, but after what happened to me yesterday I thought it wise to not be late." Sarutobi laughed openly and said, "No reason to be embarrassed, Kakashi. Naruto has pulled pranks on everyone in the village." Kakashi sighed but nodded, knowing it was true. Heck, some of Naruto's worst pranks were even worse than what happened yesterday. "Oh, that poor shop owner." Sarutobi then asked, "So what do you think?" Kakashi blinked and said, "Honestly, I don't know what to think." Sarutobi raised an eyebrow and asked, "What do you mean?" Kakashi elaborated, "I can't get a read on them, they're all over the place. Sasuke seemed like an Avenger, like his file said, but prior to and during the test he was civil towards Naruto. I seemed what Naruto said yesterday really got to him and made him think." Sarutobi nodded and smiled before saying, "Leave it to Naruto to get Sasuke to think about what he's doing." Kakashi also smiled as he continued, "As for Sakura, it's basically the same. She was acting just like a fangirl, but Naruto seemed to talk her away from this path, and I don't think I could have done that if I had tried." Sarutobi chuckled and said, "At this rate Naruto will become the village therapist and psychologist." Kakashi's eyes smiled and said, "Naruto certainly is something. He was the one that surprised me the most during the test." Sarutobi interrupted him, saying, "I already know, I was watching." Kakashi nodded and said, "Well, may I ask for your opinion, Hokage-sama?" Sarutobi replied, "I can tell the will of fire burns brightly in this generation, and they will all be the strongest generation we have ever seen, and Naruto will likely be the one to lead them." Kakashi asked, "How can you be sure?" Sarutobi got up from his chair and walked to the window and said, "I believe in them, Kakashi, that is all the basis I need." Kakashi nodded and said, "Then I will believe in them as well, Hokage-sama." Sarutobi smiled and said, Good, now Kakashi, I want each of them to be in the upper tier of our Chunin level ninja, if not lower Jonin level by the Chunin exams, is that understood? Kakashi was shocked and asked, Hokage-sama, that's only 9 months away. Why so soon and how? Sarutobi got serious and looked Kakashi dead in the eye and said, Ue is going to be competing in this year's exams along with Kumo in a new village called Otto. I was worries me because of how much Naruto looks like his father even with that mask of his. Kumo is still on watch because of the Hyuga incident. Finally Otto just popped up out of nowhere and their cage is unknown, but I have my suspicions. Don't think you're the only one being told this, both my son and Kurenai have also been told this, so do you understand? Kakashi could see the seriousness in this and said, Yes Hokage-sama, but how? Sarutobi gave a small smile and said, However you see fit. I also heard your idea for tutors and agree. So get who you need, and if need be say it's under orders from me, okay? Hi Hokage-sama, by your leave, said Kakashi as he bowed. Sarutobi waved a hand and Kakashi left through the door to return to his team. Sarutobi turned back to the window and said, Now it's time for the next generation to take over. I wonder if I'll be able to see it. With Team 7, this is the place, said Naruto as he pointed out a fairly small shop that had a sign above it with the name Iron Dragon. Sakura and Sasuke both looked at it and thought, it doesn't look like much. Both were proven wrong when they walked in. Inside was every weapon lover's wet dream. There was no place in the shop that didn't have some kind of weapon. To the left, sharp weapons like swords and spears, on the right blunt weapons like gauntlets and nunchucks. Every weapon one could possibly think of was most likely on these shelves. There was even a section for clothing. Hello, welcome to our shop, came a perky voice. Team 7 turned to see it was a girl. She wore a pink Chinese-style shirt and short pants. Her brown hair was done up in 2 buns. Naruto was surprised that she wasn't the least bit fazed by his outfit that seemed to cause heart attacks on a regular basis when he walked around. She then said, Hello, my name's Tenten. Is there anything I can help you with? Sasuke spoke. Yes, actually our sensei sent us to buy equipment to help in our general training and our specialties. She smiled and said, Alright, all I need to know is what your specialties are and I can give you the equipment for that and a standard set for more general training. Is that okay? All of Team 7 nodded. Sasuke said, Sure, name's Sasuke. As for me, I will be specializing in taijutsu, but my style focuses primarily on jumping and my legs with minimum use of my arms. Tenten nodded and said, I have to say I have never heard of a taijutsu style like that, but for that I suggest a heavier set of leg weights. Sasuke nodded. Then Sakura spoke, My style requires that I become well versed in kenjutsu. Tenten's eyes lit up and she grabbed Sakura's hands as she said, Oh, another girl that actually likes weapons. Naruto asked, What do you mean? Tenten turned to him, never releasing Sakura's hand, and said, Most girls around our age are more interested in boys, so they never realize that if they only spend time chasing them and not training they are likely to die or worse. Sakura turned slightly green and gained a horrified look at the thought and said out loud, Naruto, thank you for setting me straight. Naruto said, Anytime, Sakura. Tenten blinked at that line and said or asked, I guess you were like that till recently? Sakura nodded and said, Yeah, but Naruto got me to think about it and I decided that I don't plan on dying anytime soon, so I needed to get my ass in gear. Tenten along with Naruto smiled as Sasuke smirked at her answer. Tenten said, Good for ya. She then heard a voice, Oh, we have customers. It's nice to meet you all. My name is Dan Sparta. They all turned to see a man. He was wearing a blacksmith apron and black pants. He had short brown hair and was pretty buff, showing his experience in blacksmithing. He had a couple of scars, but that only helped his image. Dan saw who his customers were and smiled, but when he looked at Naruto he stared for a minute longer before his smile came back full force, surprising Naruto. Dan then turned to Tenten and said, Tenten, I could hear what was going on, so why don't you go help Sasuke and Sakura find what they need while I help Naruto here? Tenten nodded and beckoned Sasuke and Sakura to follow her. When they were out of hearing range, Dan bent down to Naruto's level and said, I honestly didn't expect to see you again so soon. Naruto asked, What do you mean? Dan smiled and said, I don't think I would forget someone who came into my shop under a henge and bought that same outfit, would I? Naruto looked shocked and said, I guess not. But then he asked, Why are you being nice to me? Dan looked sad and said, I have seen the way people treat you and I do know why. I can hazard a guess and say you do too based on your shirt's design. But you don't have to worry, you will always be welcome in my shop. Naruto got watery eyes and smiled. Dan continued and asked, now how can I help you? Naruto smiled and said, well, you already heard the conversation from earlier, so if I cut to the chase, I need equipment for my taijutsu, which heavy on chakra usage. Dan was confused and asked, can you describe it? Naruto continued, sure, there are 6 parts to it. I already have 2 somewhat down, but they could be improved. The first allows me to ride on sound waves so I can avoid every attack sent my way. The next allows me to harden my body to mimic iron and prevent damage to myself. The next allows me to move at sonic speeds by kicking off of the ground 10 times in the blink of an eye. Next is the ability to puncture my enemies with my fingers. Next I can send blades of wind or chakra with a kick. Finally I can literally jump in the air for as long as I need to. Dan was speechless. He had never heard of any taijutsu that could do these things, but when he managed to get a hold of himself, he said, the only things I think I can help with is the one to move at insane speeds. He got up and went to a self with Naruto right behind him. He then grabbed something. He then turned to Naruto and said, this is a gravity seal with it. Naruto cut him off and said, it can increase the gravity of any object or person it is placed on, only affecting that object or person. Dan blinked and said, well, I'm impressed. I guess you also want a set of Fuinjutsu supplies? Naruto asked, you have that? Dan smiled and said, sure do, granted it's mostly novice-level material. Naruto smiled and said, thanks. They then heard Tenten coming back with Sasuke and Sakura. Sasuke looked indifferent, but Sakura had a big grin plastered on her face. Naruto asked, why are you so happy, Sakura? Sakura held out a katana. It had a simple crossguard, with an open frame much like a 4-pane window. It has a bronze guard, with lavender hilt wrapping, and a white sheath. She then said, I don't know why, but when we passed by it I just felt like it was a part of me. Naruto smiled and said, good for you, Sakura, but you know that you won't be practicing with it, right? Sakura nodded and said, I know, that's why I grabbed this bokken. A bokken is a wooden practice sword. Dan then interrupted and said, Sakura-san, that is not a bokken, it's something similar to a shikomizu, but instead of a cane its blade is hidden in a practice sword. You can still use it for practice though, so long as you don't take the cover off. So feel free to call it a bokken for now. He then asked, is there anything else you 3 need? They all shook their heads and Dan said, alright then, let's ring you all up. They all got their new equipment paid for along with a discount. Dan was happy to provide, much to Tenten's shock, and left. As they walked down the street, Sasuke saw something and said, hey, you guys go on ahead and I'll meet up at the training grounds later. With that he left, not allowing them to say anything. Sakura and Naruto both looked at each other and shrugged before they kept walking. Training Ground 7. When Naruto and Sakura returned, they saw that Kakashi was back already and were shocked, but that quickly vanished when they noticed he was talking to 3 people. The first was male. He had a sickly look, if the bags under his eyes were any indication. He wore the average Jonin outfit. His headband was worn more like a bandana, allowing his bangs to show along with a tuft of hair right between his eyes. To finish it off, he had a standard katana held across his back. The next person was female. She was as tall as the first man. Her hair was violet colored and long, with her bangs going over her shoulders reaching halfway down her Jonin vest. She wore black gloves that reached halfway up her biceps, and over them she wore guards that covered her forearms. She also had a sword across her back. The final man made Naruto and Sakura question their sanity. He was a little taller than the others, but he had a shiny bowl-cut hairdo, wore a green spandex suit, and had eyebrows that looked like he glued on caterpillars. Over this he wore a standard Jonin vest and orange leg warmers. Sakura and Naruto continued to stare in horror until Kakashi finally noticed them and called, "Ah, Sakura, Naruto, come over here and meet your tutors." Kakashi then noticed where they were staring and I smiled before saying, "Don't worry, he's Sasuke's tutor." Both breathed a heavy sigh of relief before they heard a voice, "Who's my tutor?" They turned around to see Sasuke but widened their eyes because Sasuke no longer had his poultry haircut. Instead his hair was flat and combed down to cover the left side of his face. Sanji's hair. Besides this, nothing else had changed. Naruto and Sakura snapped out of their trance at his new haircut and pointed at the man Kakashi said was Sasuke's tutor. Sasuke looked at the man whom they pointed at and promptly paled and screamed, "Ah, hell no," before running away as fast as his legs could carry him. The man grinned before screaming, "Yash. Kakashi, your student shines almost as brightly as my own when it comes to training. Look at how eager he is. I must join him in his youth." The man then took off running after Sasuke. Naruto and Sakura couldn't believe what they had just seen and turned to Kakashi speechless. Kakashi chuckled at their expressions along with the remaining two Jonin, who walked up next to Kakashi. They then introduced themselves as Yugo Izuki and Gekko Hayate. Yugo walked up to Sakura and said with a smirk, "Kakashi has already informed us as to what you plan on doing. I speak for both of us when I say that when you finish it, you will be able to fight with the best of them. So are you ready to train?" Sakura nodded and said determined, "Yes ma'am." Yugo smiled and said, "Let's go then." With that she, Hayate, and Sakura walked over to the other side of the field. Naruto then turned to Kakashi who said, "Oh, don't worry Naruto, these kind of training will only happen 2 days a week. Other than that you will all be training together, but on these days you will be training with me on whatever you need." Naruto smiled and said, "Hi sensei." Kakashi then asked, "So we have 4 months of training, what say we get started?" Naruto grinned and said, "Let's get to it." Cue training montage. Play Harder, Better, Faster, Stronger by Daft Punk. Keep the song playing until you see the bolded word end. 4 months remaining. As the song starts we find Naruto and the rest of Team 7 doing the tree climbing exercise. Naruto and Sasuke repeatedly failing, only for Sakura to beat them to the top in minutes while they haven't even made it a fourth of the way. Naruto and Sasuke smirk as they give it another shot, this time getting twice as far. Sakura smiles as she continues to run up and down the tree over and over. 3 days later we can see Team 7 now in separate parts of the training field. Sakura is training with her hands as Yugo had told her that she should be able to defend herself with her hands before using a sword. She called this the Mutoryu, no swords style, but she was still going over basic sword handling exercise and katas. Sasuke was running more and more than he had ever done in his life combined, all for the sake of the speed he needed for his taijutsu. As he ran, Guy threw rocks of various sizes at him and made him dodge to increase his reaction time or deflect them with only his legs so as to strengthen them. Naruto could be found exchanging various jutsu with Kakashi as his clones continued to work on chakra control and fuinjutsu. He had forbidden himself from using them for anything else until both Sakura and Sasuke could also use them. 3 months left. Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura are found chasing Tora and returning her to her owner in record time, before being ushered back to the training grounds. When it came to team training, all three were currently on the lake's surface trying to use their chakra to stay afloat. Again, Sakura was the first to get the exercise as both Sasuke and Naruto fell into the water. Sakura helped them back to the surface and gave them some tips, and they were off like rockets. With this they learned their elemental affinities. Sasuke's being lightning and fire, while Sakura had earth. Naruto had to explain his affinity to chakra, saying it was natural, hiding the fact Kurama gave it to him. Jaws hit the ground fast. They were told the next month would be only used for affinities. Back to separate training. Sakura was back to training her Mutoryu by defending herself from clones of Hayate and Yugo as they attacked her, holding nothing back for hours at a time before she would be allowed to use her Boken to frantically block strikes from the clones. Sasuke was getting a good grasp on the black leg style as he fought against 5 of Naruto's clones. This only reinforced his thoughts about having help as he knew how good Naruto was and saw how Sakura was doing. Naruto began to work on his taijutsu some more and was working on his next ability, which was what he called Chakrayaku, chakra leg. He was now able to send chakra blades of various sizes at his enemies. Subject to change due to Naruto being able to control sound soon. 2 months left. This entire month was all about elemental affinities. The first 2 weeks went by fast and were very productive as Naruto, Sakura, and Sasuke sat next to each other in a triangle pattern as they each held out a leaf. As they all held out their leaves, Sakura's crumbled up, Sasuke's turned to ash as it lit on fire, and Naruto's sliced into pieces. The next 2 weeks were used to implement their affinities into their fighting styles. Naruto was able to do this quickly and created his version of the Shigen, finger gun. He called it Razendoriru, spiraling drill. Sasuke could perform a number of the black leg techniques and was still working on adding fire to them, but would be done soon. Sakura had gained a number of moves for both her Mutoryu and had started to make and learn some of the Itoryu, one sword style, techniques. On top of this, she was able to add her earth affinity to her Mutoryu to increase its power and her strength dramatically. Final month. The final month was used to teach different formation or make them. Along with more D-rank missions than before, but that didn't mean much as all the members of Team 7 could now perform most of the techniques they had set out to at the beginning of the training. Sakura was still trying to find a way to further increase her destructive power with her sword and Mutoryu. Sasuke was still trying to finish adding his fire affinity without getting burned in the end, but had also started on his lightning affinity. Finally, Naruto had set out to be able to control sound at least to some degree by the end of the month. End montage. By the end of 4 months, Team 7 had changed. Sakura had changed her look and had braided her hair to make long pink strands with tiny kunai at the ends. She also wore a red short-sleeve shirt, and much like Yugo, she had guards on her forearms. She wore her headband, which she had changed the cloth out for a bloody red color, around her waist as a belt. She now wore a pair of long black pants that reached down to her mid-femur. At her side was her sword with the lavender grip tucked in between her and her headband. She still wore black shinobi sandals. She no longer looked like a pathetic fangirl but a confident kunoichi. She had managed to learn more in the last 4 months than she had ever before and would admit it if asked. Yugo said that she was a natural when it came to learning techniques. Sasuke had also changed. He no longer wore his previous outfit, now he wore black long pants that reached the top of his steel-toe boots. He had a black long-sleeve suit shirt with a blue undershirt. He wore his headband around his left arm. He was no longer a child with an ambition of revenge but a shinobi ready to fight for his village. He was able to now perform all of the basic black leg techniques and some of the deviations. Naruto's outfit remained unchanged, but the air around him reeked of confidence for himself and his team. He had created a number of just you for himself and his team. On top of that, he had done it. He could now control sound to a moderate degree. Their tutors couldn't be more proud at how they had advanced. Kakashi smiled at his team and said, "Alright team, I think it's time for our first C-rank mission." All 3 of them smiled and nodded. From that day forward, Team 7 would carve their names in history. Missions Office. When Team 7 had entered the room, they saw the Hokage sitting in the middle of a wide desk with 2 chunin, one of which was Iruka and other that wasn't anyone they knew. Kakashi spoke after bowing to the Hokage. "Hokage-sama, I would like to request a C-rank mission for my team." Hiruzen nodded, as did Iruka. Now one might wonder why Iruka wasn't going ballistic trying to keep them in the village, fearing they may get badly injured. It's simple, he saw them spar and even spared against them, and he had to say it was beyond anything he could have expected. In a total of 30 seconds they had him bound and gagged while hanging from a tree over a fire pit. Needless to say, he did not dare to underestimate them again. Hiruzen then looked through a stack of papers and said, "Ah, here we go, I believe this will be a suitable mission. It's an escort mission to the land of Wave." He then pressed the button on his speaker and said, "Could you please bring in Mr. Tanzuna?" A voice came back a moment later saying, "Right away, Hokage-sama." A minute later, a man walked in looking like he would keel over from alcohol poisoning any second. This man was a gray-haired, bespectacled man with a large beard and dark eyes. When first introduced, he wore a sleeveless V-neck shirt with an obi, pants and a pair of sandals. He also carried a towel around his neck and wore a pointed hat on his head. The man then saw Naruto and his teammates and said in an even voice that expressed his displeasure, "The crap is this? I paid for protection, not to be the one protecting 3 brats who barely look old enough to be out of diapers." What he didn't notice were the wary looks on everyone's faces as they stared at Team 7, who the man insulted in one sentence. Their fears were realized when Sakura drew out her sword and charged it with chakra. Sasuke pulled out a couple of kunai, and Naruto conjured up 5 kunai made of chakra that were currently floating above him and his teammate while aimed at Tazuna. "Fuck!" cried the hidden Anbu invisible chunin in the office as Naruto's kunai went flying along with Sasuke's and Sakura Shuzen to gain speed. It was over in an instant. Everyone stood wide-eyed at what Naruto and his team had done. Tazuna was standing with his back to the wall and had kunai, chakra and metal versions surrounding him in the pattern of his body, with Sakura's sword centimeters away from piercing his left eye. Naruto then spoke, "Looks like you're the one that needs diapers, old man." They all looked to see that Tazuna had actually pissed himself in fear. With that, Naruto and his team left the room minus Kakashi, who looked disinterested, along with the Hokage, who had the same expression as if it was a common occurrence. Hiruzen told Kakashi while handing him the folder, "Here Kakashi, you are to leave tomorrow for this MS Scion." "Hi Hokage-sama," said Kakashi, who then left himself. As he left, he saw Team 8 entering the Hokage's office, and before he got too far heard something about a graveyard. The next morning, Naruto walked up to the north gate of Konohagakure and along the way ran into Sakura and Sasuke. They all began to walk together, and when they reached the gate they saw that both Kakashi and Tazuna were standing there discussing the smaller aspects of the mission. When they were close enough, Kakashi spoke, saying, "All good, you're all here. So are you all ready?" They all nodded, and Kakashi continued and said, "Very well, but quick equipment check." He pointed at Sakura and she said, "Cloths and rations for at least 2 to 3 weeks, 2 sets of standard 20 kunai. Same with shuriken, standard camping gear, 100 feet of ninja wire, 5 smoke bombs, 10 explosive notes, a standard medical kit, my bokken, and my sword, which is sealed in the seal on my shoulder that Naruto made." Kakashi nodded and then pointed at Sasuke, who said, "Same as Sakura minus the sword, and twice the number of smoke bombs and explosive notes." Kakashi again nodded and finally turned to Naruto, who finished, "Same as both of them with the inclusion of my flute, and standard sealing supplies." Kakashi said, "Good, now let's get going. On foot and at civilian speed, it will take 3 days to get there." With that, Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura all began to walk out of the gates with one thought: let's do this. A couple of hours later. Tazuna wouldn't admit it, but he was impressed by the way these kids acted. They were currently surrounding him in a diamond formation with their teacher in front of him, Sakura to his left, Sasuke to his right, and Naruto behind him. All of them were a maximum of 5 feet away, giving him breathing room but also staying close enough to defend him if need be. All of the genin looked bored, but that was just a guise. If there was anything they had learned in the past few months, it was that you never let your guard down on a mission, no matter how ridiculous it may seem, because anything can happen, and sadly they were about to see this firsthand. Naruto was the one who was designated as the team sensor, since it was found that he could sense anyone. Naruto actually had 2 ways to do this. Because of his friendship with Kurama, he found he could sense anyone with negative feeling or hostile intentions. The other way was his use of sound manipulation. He could use echolocation much like a bat and see everything around him, even in pitch black night. They had tested this method against Genjutsu and found that so long as the Genjutsu doesn't interfere with his hearing, he could work around it. Because of this, Naruto noticed something was off when he suddenly felt hostile emotions that were aimed at Tazuna. When he realized this, he followed the sense back to a small puddle and realized that that couldn't be real. It hadn't rained in weeks. Sasuke and Sakura also noticed this as soon as Naruto made some very discreet signs and went on full alert, but didn't make any physical motion that they had yet. Naruto whispered to Sakura, "You want to take this?" Sakura smirked and said, "Naruto, music please." Naruto smirked and unsealed his flute behind his back, not allowing it to be seen. See, Naruto had found another seal on it, and he absolutely loved this seal. He called it the auto-tune seal. Willow Smith, "Whip my hair." Official video started 20 seconds into the video. Sakura smirked as she began to walk a little faster than her team, only to stop 10 feet from the puddle and shout repeatedly, "I whip my hair back and forth." Sakura's braided hair extended to an obscene length as the kunai that decorated the ends shot towards the puddle, forcing the 2 ninja who were hiding inside of it to dodge. Both ninja were surprised at what Sakura had done, but got over it in an instant and charged the bubblegum pink-haired girl. As the ninja duo charged, they aimed to bisect Sakura using their clawed gauntlets. She countered by jumping inches above where their claws were aimed and spun in mid-air in order to deliver a strong spin kick to both of their heads, knocking them away and landing with her back turned from them. The ninja quickly retaliated by charging again, this time with a spiked chain that connected their gauntlets. Sakura didn't turn around as she dodged, this time by ducking limbo style, and had the chain go over her. She was up the second the chain passed over her and said, "Mutoryu." Impact. Sakura used her opponent's turned backs to her advantage and quickly struck them, knocking them down and possibly breaking a rib or 2. Sadly, they got back up and this time opened their clawed gauntlets wide and shot various amounts of senborn at Sakura, who proceeded to backflip in order to dodge. She continued along this path until she had come full circle. By this time the unknown assailants had run out of senborn. When she had finished her backflip routine, she quickly turned and shouted, "Ninpo!" Lasso locks. Her hair once again stretched to obscene lengths, only this time her hair was aiming to capture as opposed to kill. The unknown ninja attempted to dodge her hair, but as they moved out of the way, Sakura spun her head in a way that maneuvered her hair so that it would go past the unknown ninja and loop around, trapping them. End song. The ninja, knowing they were outmatched, decided to cut their losses by literally cutting the strands of hair that were currently holding them. They used their claws and cut the braids, one for both of them. In the second following, both proceeded to shush in a way as to escape. All members of Team 7 frowned as they saw this, except for Sakura, who was currently snarling at the empty space of where the two ninja who cut her precious hair. Kakashi smiled eerily as he turned towards Tazuna and asked, "Care to explain as to why the missing nin from Kiri made an attempt on your life?" Tazuna began to sweat bullets as he attempted to come up with a viable line. He finally decided to tell the truth upon seeing the dangerous look he was getting from the Konoha ninja. He proceeded to say, "Are you aware of a man by the name of Gato?" Kakashi raised an eyebrow as he said, or more likely question, "You mean Gato of Gato's shipping?" Tazuna nodded as he continued, "Hi, that is the one. He has been bleeding my country dry and left us with next to nothing." Sasuke questioned, "But what does that have to do with you?" Tazuna answered by saying, "Gato's control depends entirely on the fact that our nation is not connected to the mainland, and I am building a bridge that's sole purpose is to connect our land to the mainland, thus destroying his control over us." The four ninja nodded in understanding as they now fully comprehended slowing the situation, and then Naruto said with a carefree tone, "Well, you could have just told us that in the first place and we're sure that the Hokage would have found some way of helping." The other smiled in Naruto's careless attitude towards the situation as he attempted to lighten the mood, but they still agreed with his statement. "Really?" questioned Tanzuna, not quite sure if he understood what he was being told. "You really keep going?" Kakashi continued by saying, "That has yet to be determined. Team, I will leave it up to you to decide whether we continue or return to Konoha." The three genin didn't even need to give it a second thought. All three nodded simultaneously while staring at their sensei. Kakashi's eyes smiled before turning back to Tanzuna and saying, "Well, looks like the second went in for a while longer." Tanzuna beamed in happiness and exclaimed, "Well, let's get to it." With that he began to walk down the path, quickly followed by Team 7, who recreated their formation. With the demon brothers. "What the fuck was that?" screamed Gozu as he and his brother ran like hell was on their tails. "I don't know, we were informed that the old man would be unable to hire anything more than a genin team with one jonin," said Maizu as he tried to rationalize what had happened. After a moment of contemplation he decided, "After we are sure that they aren't following us, we will return to base and inform Zabuza of what happened and make a plan for later, okay?" Gozu nodded. With that they both picked up the pace back to base. Hee rhyme. Back with Team 7 the next day. Team 7 continued on their path towards Tazuna's home and were currently walking through the forest. Naruto then saw a break in the foliage. He relayed this to the others by saying, "Hey guys, look, there's a lake up ahead right through the trees." Tanzuna smiled and said, "That's good, that lake is a landmark for travelers so they know where they are. Walk along the left side of it, we will get there faster." The ninja nodded at his directions as they walked. When they entered the clearing they went the direction Tanzuna had told them to go. The only problem was not even 20 feet later Naruto threw a kunai at the bushes to their left, putting everyone on alert. Kakashi asked seriously, "Naruto, what's wrong?" Naruto didn't answer as he walked over to the bushes and spread them apart. When you finish this, all he found was a scared white rabbit with a kunai inches above its head. Naruto, "Careful, I don't like this," said Kurama, expressing his displeasure with this situation. Now if this were the old Naruto he would have instantly hugged the rabbit and apologized repeatedly. But this Naruto, though sorry for the fact he traumatized the animal, picked it up and showed it to his team. When the others had seen the rabbit it took a Kakashi no time to narrow his eyes, but Sakura and Sasuke took a second to recognize the importance. Within seconds they had surrounded Tanzuna in a protective formation, one person at each side, front, back, left, and right. "What is going on?" shouted Tanzuna as he was surprised by the sudden action. Kakashi answered, "Enemies nearby. The rabbit was used for a substitution just you. We can tell by the color of its fur. Being mid-spring it should be brown not white." The second he finished he heard the sound of something slicing the air. Naruto beat him in calling, "Duck." Sasuke and Sakura did just that. Kakashi wasn't far behind as he pulled Tanzuna with him to the ground. Naruto, to Tanzuna's disbelief, simply turned around and stared at the air before calling, "Current." Naruto waited for the right moment before doing what he did in his fight against Mizuki and bent back far enough that the object began to fly over him. When the object was directly above him he shot his palms up, began to redirect the object by twisting and turning his arms and body until he was able to control the direction, and after a second he implanted the object in the ground. The offending object kicked up a dust cloud as it impacted the ground. As the cloud subsided the object could be seen it was a good 6 feet long and foot wide, not including the thin handle. It was black with a razor-sharp edge and had a hole in it near the curved top of the blade with a half circle taken out of the edge. At that moment a mist began to settle in the area, reducing visibility to near zero. They then heard someone clapping. They stared into the mist just above the lake, and the spot that they stared at seemed to open up as if it were a curtain revealing a figure standing on the water. The figure was a tall and noticeably muscular man with pale skin, short spiky black hair, brown eyes, and small eyebrows. He was normally seen wearing bandages like a mask over the bottom half of his face. He was seen shirtless, with his chest only covered by a belt. He was wearing baggy pants with the striped pattern and mimetic wrist warmers extending up to his elbows, with matching leg warmers. Kakashi glared at the man and said, "I didn't expect to meet you here of all places, Zabuza Momochi, or should I call you, the demon of the hidden mist?" The now named Zabuza responded by saying, "And I did not expect to run into such a high-profile target such as you, Kakashi Hitaki, or should I refer to you as, Kakashi of the Sharingan?" Kakashi said in a low tone, "Well, I'm flattered, but as you can see we're in a bit of a rush, so if you don't mind we will just be on our way." Zabuza raised a finger and shook it while saying, "Not so fast, Kakashi. We all have our own job to do and mine just happens to be to kill that old man." Kakashi sighed and said while lifting his headband showing his Sharingan eye, "Well, it seems we have reached an impasse, so I guess end of way to settle this." Zabuza got into his stance and said, "It seems so." With that said, Zabuza was off running at high John and low Anbu speed towards Naruto. As he ran he began to form seals, and after a moment he called, "Sweden." Gunshot. He shot a large glob of water at high velocity towards Team 7 and Tanzuna, forcing them to jump away in order to avoid being hit. Because they jumped, Zabuza was able to reclaim his weapon that Naruto had embedded in the ground. As Zabuza lifted his blade he said, "I will say this, that boy there has a lot of talent to be able to maneuver Kabikirabocho like that." Naruto, who had landed a moment later and placed Tanzuna on the ground, replied, "Thanks for the compliment, too bad we still have to kick your ass." Zabuza smirked under his bandaged face and replied, "Bring it." That said, Zabuza began to form more seals and called, "Sweden." Water clones. Zabuza, using the water in the nearby lake, created 9 water clones to combat Team 7. Naruto responded to this action by creating 3 shadow clones which proceeded to surround Tanzuna in a triangle formation, whereas he, Sakura, and Sasuke took defensive measures by placing themselves in between Tanzuna and Zabuza's clone. Kakashi then stated, "Be careful, each of his clones may only be 10% of his max strength, but that's still enough to give a decent Chunin a challenge. They still have more experience than you do. I will take on the real Zabuza while you all deal with the clones." "Hi, Sensei," replied the genin of Team 7 as they readied themselves for battle. This meant that Sakura settled into her Mutoryu fighting stance. Naruto unsealed his flute, and Sasuke powered down his weight and resistance seals. Zabuza, impressed by the action and speed to which the team had acted, said, "Well, I am impressed, too bad they will all die here." He then signaled the clones to attack. Naruto glared at the 9 opposing clones and said, "Don't worry, Kakashi-sensei, we got these jokers." He then lifted his left hand to his side, while pointing his index finger and middle finger in between the groups of 3 clones before calling, "Razandoriru." Burrowing shot. In one quick motion Naruto threw his fist forward with his 2 fingers outstretched. As they went through the motion they were covered in chakra that took the form of drills. When Naruto's hand reached its full length, the chakra drills flew from his fingertips, forcing the 9 clones to jump away and divide into 3 separate groups of 3 clones each as the drills expanded and the road into the ground, leaving good-sized trenches in it. Each member of Team 7 went after a different set of clones except for Kakashi, who went after the original Zabuza, while Naruto's clones guarded Tanzuna. Kakashi went out to meet his adversary on the lake's surface when he was mere meters away from his opponent. Zabuza said, "Well Kakashi, I gotta give it to you, those are some pretty talented chunin you got there." Kakashi openly laughed at what Zabuza had said. Zabuza, confused by the action, asked, "And what's got you so happy?" Kakashi managed to get himself under control rather quickly and answer the question by saying, "It's the fact that you think they're chunin." He then had the gall to chuckle again. Zabuza was now very confused and said, "What the hell you mean Kakashi, there's no way they could be higher than that, they are too young." Kakashi, reining in his chuckles, said all too mockingly, "Who said anything about them being a higher rank?" Zabuza's eyes widened in an instant and shouted, "You can't mean?" Even though Zabuza couldn't see it, Kakashi was smirking up a storm as he said, "That's right, and to top it off, they've only been genin for 4 months. With that said, Zabuza's eyes opened to unbelievable proportions. Kakashi, taking great joy in this, said as he turned his eyes towards his genin team, "Now let's watch." Zabuza followed the motion shortly thereafter and watched the team take on his clones. Sakura versus clones. Sakura stared down her 3 clone opponents as they all landed on the shoreline of the lake, which was completely devoid of trees. She wasted no time in rushing her opponents at low chunin speed she had acquired during her training these past 4 months. The clones prepared for her first assault by standing as if not expecting much. They soon learned this was a mistake when the clone standing in the middle of their group was forced to dodge when Sakura called, "Mutoryu, impact." The clone, not willing to see what would have happened, jumped out of the way, and luckily so as the ground when Sakura struck left a good 1 foot wide and ½ foot deep size indent in the ground. All the clones' eyes went wide at the show of strength for a genin, not that they knew that, and quickly readied themselves for the assault. The clone in the middle that had originally dodged the assault gestured for the one on his left to attack. The clone nodded and proceeded to run at Sakura, who had returned to her original stance and prepared herself for battle. As the clone neared her, it threw a straight punch at her, which Sakura dodged by jumping back and putting some distance between them. The clone, having expected something like this, went through hand signs and called, "Sweden. Water bullet barrage." The clone began to fire off a number of hand-sized water bullets at Sakura. Sakura went through her own hand signs and said, "Doden. Earth wall." A wall of earth slightly taller than Sakura grew from the ground and blocked the bullets. The thing was, Sakura was still relatively new, with just you having focused mainly on her Kenjutsu and Taijutsu, so when the wall blocked most of the bullets, the clone began to concentrate them into one spot, and it only took a couple of seconds for the concentrated barrage to break through the wall. Sakura dodged the remaining bullets to the best of her ability but was grazed by a couple of them, the deepest being on her left arm with minor spots on her legs and torso. The clone then smirked and charged Sakura as she was regaining her balance. Sakura had no time to dodge as the clone's fist slammed into her stomach, knocking the air out of her lungs and sending her flying. The clone grinned at the clear hit, but Sakura was not done because as she flew in the air she whispered, "Boom." The clone was able to hear her and its eyes widened as it looked down at its arm to see an explosive note attached to its forearm. The last thing it was able to think as the paper glowed was, "Well shit." Boom. The explosion sounded, destroying the clone and leaving a crater in its wake. The explosion granted Sakura the time she needed to regain her composure and right herself as the other 2 clones guarded themselves from the explosion. Sakura placed her hand on her sword's grip, and while the smoke was still present in the form of a cloud, she called, "Itoryu. Draw and resheath technique. Lion song." Sakura disappeared in a burst of speed equal to that of someone who was mid-level chunin. She barreled through the smokescreen, creating a tunnel in the smoke by use of pure speed. Sakura reappeared behind the farthest clone and stood up from her crouched position before sheathing her blade, and with an audible click her sword was sheathed and the clone directly behind her dissolved into water. The final clone turned to see his fellow clone dissolve. The clone said, "Not bad girlie, you're pretty good with a sword for someone who just started to use one." Sakura glared and asked, "How do you know I just started recently?" The clone replayed, I am an expert in kenjutsu. It's easy for someone with enough experience to see. Sakura nodded to this. The clone then said, now let's finish this. The clone then went through a set of seals and shouted, Sweden. Tidal surge. A 9-foot wall of water grew from lake by the clone and he sent it to crush Sakura. Sakura smirked and said, did you know that the average civilian can jump a maximum of 28 inches or 2 feet 4 inches? The clone confused said, what does that have to do with anything? Sakura spoke, as the wave was now 40 feet away, saying, well, a fit shinobi or kunoichi can jump twice that height, so around 4 feet 8 inches. The wave was around 20 feet away by now, as the clone said, and? Sakura grinned as she drew her sword and dashed at the wave, saying, add chakra to the equation and you can double that height. So in other words, Sakura jumped up and towards the wave with only 10 feet of distance in between her and the wave. Sakura could be seen inches above the wave as she held her sword in a downward slash position, screaming, I can get higher than you can reach. Now disappear, it or you. Demon cut. With that, Sakura let gravity do the work as she fell with the power she put behind her slash. Yes, do it, came voice in Sakura's head. She didn't have time to wonder what that voice was as she fell. She was once again in a crouched position beside the clone, who smirked and said, not bad at all. With that, a cut appeared and bisected the clone from left shoulder to right hip, destroying it as it turned back to water. Sakura wasted no time and ran to aid her teammates, all the while wondering what that voice was. Sasuke vs. clones. Sasuke stared at his 3 clone opponents just as they did to him. Sasuke, over the period of time they spent training, had learned to analyze his opponents. As such, he could gauge the strength of each clone. He scanned them, the tree line, shore, and lake, for anything he could that would help him in this fight. He found nothing and turned his full attention to the clones of this missing nin. Kakashi had every member read through copies of the bingo book so they could see there were hundreds of strong shinobi and kunoichi in the world that would not hesitate to kill them. Among them was this man, Zabuza Momoichi, aka the demon of the hidden mist, wanted for the attempted coup against the third Mizukage. He was an Anbu-level shinobi at the time, and it was doubtful that he had gotten weaker since then. While there wasn't a scale by which ranks could be determined, Sasuke still knew that even 10% of the power of an Anbu-level ninja was at least low Chunin level, and that was still likely too low of an estimate. Though Sasuke couldn't see it, he knew the clones were smirking, and that pissed him off. Sasuke settled into his stance with his right side out front and his hands in his pockets. The clones openly laughed as the one in the front said, "Is this kid serious?" Sasuke said nothing as he began to run at the clones bent forward. The clone said, "Your funeral, kid." Sasuke kept on running as the first clone threw a punch aimed for Sasuke's face. The problem was, by the time the punch was thrown, Sasuke had already jumped over the first clone and doing a flip in midair before sending a downward kick, calling, "Hey Paul." The kick landed on the second clone's shoulder, forcing it to its knees, but Sasuke was not done yet. As he landed, he called, "Collier," and span on his heel to deliver a strong spin kick to the clone's neck, sending it flying into a tree and destroying it with a splat. Sasuke still wasn't done as he saw the other clones charging him from both sides. In response, he jumped and landed on his hands while beginning to spin. He called, "Quasi." The clones were unable to avoid the kicks and were pushed back after using their arms to defend themselves from the onslaught. Sasuke returned to his upright position quickly and was forced to jump to the side to avoid the kunai, but was unprepared for the second one from behind that lodged itself in his left thigh. Sasuke growled in pain as the kunai hit. He couldn't pull it out yet because both of the clones began to go through hand signs before both called, "Sweden." Water bullet. Both clones shot their respective bullets at Sasuke. Sasuke knew he had to defend himself, so he went through some hand signs and called, "Kaden." Evaporation. This was an easy D rank just you to learn and usually only used for drying small areas to set up camp. Sasuke, however, poured as much chakra as he could into it, creating an area of about 20 feet filled with intense heat. As the bullets reached the area, they began to grow smaller and smaller as the heat turned them into steam. Even though the bullets were reduced in size, they were still the size of a fist when they hit Sasuke on the left shoulder blade in his lower rib cage. The first bullet would leave a good-sized bruise, and he would swear at least on rib was fractured. Sasuke's head fell as he shook. Sasuke was not happy. No, he was royally pissed, and he was about to show these clones what he was made of. He lifted his head to reveal his now red eyes with a black tomo. Sasuke Uchiha's Sharingan had awoken. Sasuke ripped the kunai out of his leg and threw the bloody kunai at the clone behind him. The clone dodged, but Sasuke took the moment he was granted and shot forward in a crouched jump, using his good leg to propel him at the clone in front of him. As he ran, he drew another kunai while calling, "Jigit!" Sasuke landed right before the clone, and using his good leg he gave a wide kick powered by his dash and attempted to knock the clone off its feet. The clone saw this coming and jumped over the kick, but Sasuke continued by charging the kunai with a decent amount of chakra that made the kunai glow a dull blue and threw it at the still airborne clone, who had no way to dodge, was skewered through the face and dissolved into water. Sasuke turned and quickly began going through hand seals before taking a deep breath and calling, "Kaden! Grand Fireball!" Sasuke took a deep breath as he turned, and as soon as he stopped he blew out a fireball the size of an adult male. The clone jumped back and landed on the lake that wasn't far away and formed its own seals, calling, "Sweden! Water wall!" A wall of water grew out of the lake's surface, protecting the clone from the fireball. The fireball created a cloud of steam on contact with the water surrounding both Sasuke and the clone. The clone laughed as Sasuke lost all vision of it in the cloud of steam. The clone began to speak, "Heart, liver, lung, brain, so many places I can kill you, but which one should I use?" Sasuke ignored the taunt and focused on finding his target by extending his senses as far as he could. The clone found Sasuke rather easily, given the fact that Zabuza was a master of the silent killing technique and excelled in areas with little visibility. The clone smirked as it reached for a kunai not even 5 feet in front of the boy and went for the stab to end his life. Only for Sasuke's Sharingan to see a glint of light and some minor chakra usage. Sasuke ducked under the stab and grabbed the clone's outstretched arm and calling, "Poitrine!" Sasuke pulled the clone in by its arm and used his right leg to kick the clone with his foot pointed out. The kick worked better than he thought, as the added force from pulling the clone in actually allowed Sasuke's foot to go through the clone's chest and out the back. The clone looked at Sasuke and saw his eyes for the first time and said, "So you are an Uchiha, must be the lone survivor of your clan. No wonder I lost, you saw me even through the steam." Sasuke said nothing as the clone turned back into water, freeing his leg and allowing him to leave. This was the scene Sakura showed up to shortly after defeating her set of clones. Sakura smiled slightly and asked, "Need some help?" She then sat next to him as her hands glowed a lively green. Sasuke nodded and said, "Yeah, thanks." With that, Sakura began to do a quick patch job on Sasuke's leg using her currently limited skills in medical jutsu. She could finish it later, for now they needed to be able to finish it in a little over a minute. When they both got to their feet, Sasuke said, "Now let's hurry over and help Naruto." Sakura nodded quickly and they both began to run towards where Naruto was fighting. Naruto vs. clones. The Zabuza clones were once again underestimating Team 7 as they faced Naruto, who just stood there watching them. One of the clones decided to try an egg on Naruto by saying, "Well, bring it on, shorty." Naruto had gained a fair amount of self-control the last few months while training with Kakashi, meaning that while on the outside Naruto was staring at the clones of Zabuza with an annoyed expression, on the inside he was seething at the gab at his height. Naruto was mentally screaming things such as, "Oh, it is on now, bozo, I am going to destroy your clones first, then I'm coming for you, let's see who's short when I cut you in half with chakra manipulation. Foxclaw." Kurama listened in amusement at Naruto's mental outburst, or would it be in burst? He then said, "Naruto," to get the boy's attention. Naruto was shaken from his thought process of how to kill Zabuza, which included shoving Kabikirabocho where the sun don't shine, and thought, "What's up, Kurama?" Kurama responded while stretching, "Since you seem so eager to fight, I want you to use only chakra manipulation for the fight. You have been slacking off in favor of your instruments." Naruto nodded, seeing as what Kurama said was true. While he had used Kurama's chakra manipulation ability a fair bit, he had focused mostly on his flute and music, along with learning his wind affinity, and creating his sound just you. Naruto concluded, "Alright, Kurama will do." Naruto's attention was returned to the clones when he heard the one who called him the S word a moment ago say, "Come on already, what are you scared?" He and the other clones began to laugh for a minute before the sound of slicing wind caught their attention as they saw a kunai made of chakra embedded in the ground before it dissipated into wisps of chakra that floated up into the air, making the clones lift their heads with it, only to find Naruto standing with his arms outstretched with a number of chakra kunai floating in the air. The evil grin on Naruto's face displayed his intentions as the clones heard him scream, "Chakra manipulation!" Kunai barrage. The numerous amount of kunai shot forward towards the clones, who were forced to dodge them all. One of the clones screamed, completely shocked, "Chakra release, are you fucking serious?" As he and the other two clones dodged more and more kunai for a little while longer. Naruto was having a blast pelting the clones that dared make fun of his height. That is until one of the clones got sick of being used for target practice and began to go through hand signs before calling, "Sweden! Wild water wave!" The clone created a thick wave of water from the lake and sent it forward. The wave knocked the kunai off path and had them dissipate. The wave, however, was still going strong as it neared Naruto. Naruto calmly watched as the wave neared him while thinking, "Let's do this, Kurama." Kurama grinned at the thought and said, "Go for it." Naruto lifted his hand, with the middle and index fingers extended while the others were curled into a fist. He then made a sweeping motion with them and shouted, "Chakra manipulation. Barrier." As soon as Naruto said this, a three-sided pyramid of dark blue chakra formed around Naruto, creating a wedge that the wave hit seconds later. The barrier did its job and protected Naruto from the wave by forming a splitting edge that cut the wave in half and sent it to either side of Naruto. Naruto dropped the barrier the second the wave was gone. He panted slightly as he thought, "That just you still takes a lot out of me." Kurama commented by saying, "Of course it does. That barrier you just made contained about 30% of your total stores of chakra." Moments later, the clones charged at Naruto. Naruto prepared himself by calling, "Chakra manipulation. Fox claws." Creating his pursed chakra claws, Naruto settled into his stance. The clones soon reached Naruto only for him to dodge the straight punch by screaming current and bending around the fist and getting behind the clone and in one quick motion slice the clone in half just like promised. The remaining clones didn't stop their charge. Just because one of them fell did not mean they would. When they reached Naruto, one of them dropped to the ground and attempted to knock Naruto off his feet with a wide kick. Naruto jumped over the kick but was caught off guard when the second clone leapt over the clone that was still on the ground and kicked Naruto in the chest, sending him flying in the lake. Naruto was currently underwater nursing the bruise and broken rib that kick had left. All the while thinking, "Any ideas, Kurama?" Kurama thought for a moment, while healing Naruto's rib, and said, "Improvise." Naruto deadpanned and thought, "Are you serious?" Kurama was quick to respond and said, "Completely." Naruto shrugged his shoulders and thought, "Okay." The clones stared at the water for a couple of minutes and were beginning to think the boy had been knocked unconscious and had drowned. This thought was quickly replaced when they heard a shout, "Chakra manipulation. Senborn shower." A literal shower of senborn made of chakra was launched at the clones from the tree line. The clones attempted to dodge, but the closer of the two clones was destroyed when a senborn managed to pierce its leg, slowing it enough for the majority of the senborn to impact and destroy the clone. The final clone narrowed its eyes as it asked, "How did you get around us? We saw you fall in the lake." Naruto grinned and said, "Easy. I just swam to the bank a little ways away and then entered the forest to get back and haught you with my attack." The clone then said, "Why didn't we sense you though, brat?" Naruto's grin grew larger as he asked, "What's your point back home? I could escape from Enbu. What makes you so special?" With that said, Naruto charged the clone, forming another chakra kunai. The clone's eyes went wide at that question, or was it a statement, but quickly regained its composure and decided to end this with one shot as quick as it could to call its "Just You," knowing the boy couldn't reach him in time. The clone finished its "Just You" with plenty of time left and called, "Sweden. Water dragon." Out of the lake grew a large dragon of water that wasted no time in charging at Naruto. Naruto smirked as he ran towards the dragon, doing what most would consider certain death, but Naruto decided to play his hand and called, "Soru." Seconds before the dragon hit him, Naruto completely vanished and the dragon hit the ground doing nothing. Now to be fair, Naruto was still working on this move. Soru is supposed to work by kicking off of the ground 10 times in the blink of an eye. Naruto still had a long way to go as he was only at 3 kicks per second. That being said, it still granted him a speed boost, making his low chunin speed that of a high-level chunin. The clone watched his dragon hit the ground, missing the target, but was unable to act as it was already over. Naruto appeared inches from the clone and shoved the kunai up through the clone's bottom jaw and into its brain, effectively killing it. The clone reverted to water, soaking Naruto, who stood to his full height and shook the water off. Moments later, Sasuke and Sakura jumped into the area and were greeted by a grinning Naruto, who said, "You guys done?" They both nodded, confirming they had finished their opponents. Naruto nodded in acceptance of this information and suddenly got serious and said, "Sakura, go back to Tanzuna and protect him while Sasuke and I go help Kakashi sensei." Sakura said nothing, but she did nod before she left. Naruto turned to Sasuke and said, "Let's go." Sasuke replayed with a simple, "Alright." Kakashi and Zabuza. Zabuza was in a word shocked, and he had good reason to be. Just one of his clones was normally enough to defeat most newly made Chunin teams. So to see 3 new genin defeat 3 of them each was beyond disturbing, and to be honest, it scared him of what these 3 would become in the next few years. Kakashi couldn't help but grin at the bandaged look of shock Zabuza had and said, "So what do you think of my cute genin team?" Zabuza turned his full attention to Kakashi and looked him dead in the eye before saying, "What kind of drugs do you leaf nin put these kids on?" Naruto and Sasuke landed next to Kakashi at that moment, and Naruto said, "None. The thing that made us as strong as we are is pure determination and hard work." Zabuza then said, "Well damn." With that he went through 2 sets of seals, one with each hand, and shouted, "Sweden. Hidden mist just to water dragon." Out of the lake 3 large water dragons formed behind Zabuza, who sent them forward quickly while the mist began to get thicker and thicker. Naruto, Sasuke, and Kakashi quickly dodged the dragons by jumping back a fair distance, landing on the shore of the lake, but by this time Zabuza had completely been enveloped by the mist. As they prepared themselves by settling into their fighting stances, Zabuza's voice came blaring through the mist saying, "1 week Kakashi. You and your genin get 1 week to prepare, because when I return I will rain down a picture of bloody hell." With that his voice stopped and the mist lifted. After a few minutes, the team waited for a few more minutes in their stances before slowly lowering them, seeing there really was no more danger. Kakashi turned to his team and said, "Okay everyone, let me start by saying I am proud of you all, and you did an exceptional job, each taking down 3 of Zabuza's clones, all of which are low to mid-level chunin in strength." Naruto, Sakura, and Sasuke all smiled at the praise they were given, though Sasuke settled for a smirk instead of a grin similar to Naruto and Sakura. Kakashi turned to Tanzuna and asked, "How much further is it to our destination? We need rest so Sakura and Sasuke can heal." Tanzuna broke out of his shock at the sight of what Naruto and his friends had done and said with a smile, "We are actually only about an hour away from the village, and from there it's another 5 or so minutes to my home." Kakashi nodded and turned back to Team 7 and said, "Okay guys, we are almost there, so as soon as we do get there, Sakura, heal yourself, then rest a little before healing Sasuke full. While you're resting I will administer basic first aid until you are able to finish him, okay?" They all nodded at this and said in unison, "Hi sensei." Kakashi nodded back before turning and saying, "Alright, let's go." That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.